This is an original fictional horror story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental. The database exists because nobody official wants to admit it should. My name is James Hartley, and for the past 8 years, I've worked as a data analyst for the National Park Service's Visitor Safety Division. It's a position that sounds important and is, in fact, almost entirely unremarkable, processing incident reports, updating safety statistics, maintaining records that almost nobody reads. But in that bureaucratic tedium, I found something that nobody had bothered to find before. A pattern so consistent, so deliberate, and so thoroughly impossible that my supervisors did everything they could to convince me I was seeing phantom correlations. I wasn't. The official count of unexplained disappearances across America's national parks over the past 40 years is 47. That number sits in government reports that are released to the public with carefully neutral language. Missing persons, cases where no remains were recovered and circumstances remain inconclusive. These disappearances are distributed across parks, spread across decades, treated as isolated tragedies connected only by geography and bad luck. But when you work with the data long enough, when you stop treating each case as separate and start looking at them as pieces of a larger puzzle, different patterns emerge. I discovered the first inconsistency on a Tuesday in March during a routine audit of the missing persons database. A hiker named Michael Torres had vanished from Great Smoky Mountains in 1994. His disappearance was listed as a standard search and rescue case with an inconclusive outcome. Possible factors: disorientation, injury, wildlife encounter. The case was closed after 3 months. Standard procedure. But I noticed something odd in the interview notes that were supposed to be deleted after a certain period but had been preserved in an older archival backup. Torres's hiking partner, a woman named Linda Chen, reported that Torres had mentioned seeing someone watching from the ridge about an hour into their hike. Chen said Torres seemed increasingly nervous. He'd insisted they turn back, but as they were descending, he'd stopped suddenly and told her to keep going without him. He said he needed to photograph something. She'd protested, but he was adamant. When she looked back, he was already walking back up the trail. Lin Chen reached the parking area alone. Rangers organized a search that found no trace of Torres, no body, no equipment, no indication he'd ever reached the location he'd claimed to see. What caught my attention was a note written by the ranger conducting the interview. Witness seems reliable, but claims about watcher on ridge unsubstantiated. Possible confabulation or misremembering under trauma. Recommend closing inquiry. But Torres's disappearance wasn't isolated. I started searching for similar patterns in other cases. Cases where witnesses reported another person, someone watching, following, gesturing moments before a hiker vanished. Cases where the missing person had acted oddly, insisted on separating from their group, or described seeing someone who shouldn't have been there. The search took weeks. I went through hundreds of case files, cross-referencing reports, looking for the specific language of witness testimony: watching, following, standing still on a ridge, signaling, beckoning. By the end of the first month, I'd identified 6 cases across different parks with consistent descriptions of an unseen third party. By the second month, I found 12. By the third month, I'd located 31 cases spanning from Yellowstone to Zion, from Acadia to the Grand Canyon, where missing persons cases included reports of someone else being present, someone who was never found, never identified, who sometimes seemed to influence the disappearance itself. I compiled my findings into a report and submitted it to my department head, Dr. Reginald Foster. Foster had been with the Park Service for 30 years. He read my report in silence, his face becoming progressively more uncomfortable. "This is good work, James," he said slowly. "Detailed, thorough, which is why I need you to bury it." I must have looked as confused as I felt because he continued, "Not destroy it, bury it. File it in a secure location, mark it as preliminary research pending further verification, and then stop looking. Don't pursue this pattern any further. Don't share it with colleagues. Don't present it in any form. Why? I asked. If there's a pattern in disappearances, if there's something that could help us identify a serial killer, or there is no serial killer, Foster interrupted. If there were, that would be one problem. This is something else entirely, and it's not something we can solve with statistics and interviews. It's something we've known about for longer than either of us has been in this job. And we've made peace with that knowledge by doing what we can, closing certain trails, restricting access to certain areas, managing the information flow to the public. Your work makes it harder to maintain that equilibrium. I stared at him. You're telling me the Park Service knows something and is actively concealing it? I'm telling you that some things are too large and too old for a federal agency to do anything about them, except manage the fallout. And I'm telling you that you have a choice. Accept that and move on with a very safe, very stable career, or keep digging and find out exactly how dangerous it can be to know too much about something that doesn't want to be known. He wasn't threatening me. That's what made it worse. He was being paternal, almost sad about it. I went home that night and began a secret project that I never would have done if Foster hadn't pushed back. I started reconstructing the disappearances from my personal copies of the data. I built a timeline. I mapped locations. I created a visual representation of where disappearances had occurred and when. The pattern wasn't random. The disappearances formed a geographic distribution that moved slowly, almost imperceptibly across the country over 4 decades. There were clusters, a series of disappearances in Yellowstone in the late 1980s, then a shift to the Tetons, then nothing for 3 years, followed by a cluster in Colorado, disappearances in Utah, Arizona, California, then back across the Midwest, then the Appalachian Parks. The distribution followed no logical route, but it followed a route nonetheless. It was moving through the national parks like something was herding, like something was following a path that only it understood. I spent a month analyzing the cases in the clusters, looking for anything that might explain the movement. I found something worse than an explanation. In Yellowstone, between 1985 and 1990, there had been 8 missing persons cases, 4 more than I'd initially identified. The cluster appeared near specific geothermal features. In the Tetons, 6 disappearances, all within 5 miles of hidden falls. In Colorado, 7 disappearances, all from trails that connected to remote mining roads. The geographic pattern wasn't random at all. It was tracing something ancient. The disappearances were following geothermal hotspots, ancient mining sites, geological formations associated with mineral deposits and underground water systems. The pattern was following the Earth's blood, its thermal arteries and mineral veins. That's when I knew I couldn't stop investigating. I took vacation time and drove to Yellowstone. I arrived in late May, when the park was opening its high country trails after spring snowmelt. I checked into a small hotel in West Yellowstone and spent my first full day at the park's administrative office, requesting historical incident reports for the areas where disappearances had occurred. The administrator was a woman named Patricia Marsh, who looked like she'd been working there since the park was established. "These are old cases," she said, reviewing my requests, "most from the 80s and early 90s. Why do you need them? Are you a journalist?" "I'm doing research," I said, which was technically true. Historical analysis of visitor safety trends. Something in her expression shifted. She'd heard that before, or something like it. "You're not the first person to ask," she said quietly. "Someone came through, about 15 years ago, asking almost identical questions. Young woman, said she was a graduate student. She seemed driven, like she'd found something and needed to understand it. What happened to her? She got what she was looking for, I think. She left the park very abruptly after about 2 weeks here. Didn't finish her research. Didn't contact anyone to arrange archival access. Just left. I remember hoping she was okay. I felt the first real chill of this entire investigation. Marsh provided the files I requested, and I spent that night in my hotel room, reading through decades of incident reports. The cases were worse than the database suggested. Not just disappearances, but descriptions of behavior that preceded them. Hikers who became fixated on reaching specific locations. Groups where one member would suddenly insist on separating, often claiming they'd seen something or someone the others couldn't see. Equipment that went missing moments before disappearances. Testimonies from search and rescue teams describing odd phenomena sounds that seemed to come from deep in the earth. Trails that seemed to loop back on themselves. A persistent sense of being followed. One report from 1987 was written by a ranger named David Corr, who'd led a search for a missing hiker in the Mirror Pool area. His account was different from the others, less official, more personal. He wrote, "I have been a ranger for 11 years. I have led dozens of search and rescue operations. I know how to read terrain, how to anticipate where a lost hiker might go, how to find bodies when nature has taken them. But the search for Marcus Webb is unlike anything I have experienced. We have followed his trail to a specific location near the geothermal vents, a place no casual hiker would wander without purpose. At the site, we found evidence of deliberate movement, overturned rocks, suggesting a path had been marked, disturbed soil, indicating someone had dug or searched for something. But we found no body. What we did find was a smell, faint but distinct, coming from beneath the earth, a smell like sulfur and something else, something organic. I recommend this location be closed to public access. I also recommend we stop trying to find Marcus Webb. I believe he is no longer in any location where we can find him." Corr's recommendation was noted but not acted upon. The area remained open. 3 more people disappeared from that general vicinity over the next 4 years. I spent 3 days in Yellowstone, visiting some of these locations, trying to understand what the geographic pattern really meant. I hiked to Mirror Pool, which was still accessible, and descended toward the geothermal features. The smell Corr had described was still there, faint but unmistakable. Sulfur and decay and something else, something ancient. The water in the pools was a brilliant blue-green, almost artificial looking in its saturation. I found disturbed earth near one of the larger vents, areas that looked like they'd been excavated and refilled multiple times. When I dropped a stone into one of the pools, it didn't splash the way it should have. The water seemed to absorb the stone without ripples, and I heard or felt something deep beneath the earth respond. A vibration that didn't travel through my feet, but through the air itself, a frequency just at the edge of hearing. I left Yellowstone that night and drove 6 hours to Grand Teton National Park. The disappearances in the Tetons had been concentrated around Cascade Canyon, near Hidden Falls, a trail that was still open, still popular, where dozens of people hiked every day. I reached the trailhead early in the morning and found it crowded with tourists. I waited for a group of hikers to move ahead on the trail, then started my own walk. The canyon was beautiful in a way that seemed designed to make you let your guard down. The water was pristine, the mountains massive and protective. The trail was well maintained. There was nothing here that suggested danger, but I was paying attention now to small things. The way sounds seemed to carry strangely. An echo from ahead would arrive at odd intervals, as if it was traveling through multiple mediums. The way the trail seemed longer than the posted distances. The way markers seemed to appear less frequently than expected. The way groups ahead of me would somehow end up behind me without passing. I reached Hidden Falls in 2 hours and rested there, watching the spray, photographed the location. I was turning to leave when I noticed something odd about the rocks behind the falls. The spray had created a clear area, a curtain of water, but beyond it I could see stone that looked wrong, too regular, carved rather than natural. I stepped closer, getting drenched in the cold water. Behind the falls was an opening, a gap in the rock that opened down into darkness. I pulled out my flashlight, I'd come prepared, and aimed it into the gap. The light disappeared into a shaft that descended at an angle. The smell that emerged was overwhelming, mineral, ancient, and underneath it all, something like the smell of burial. I heard something then, not from inside the cave, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere that seemed to exist below or beside normal geography. A sound like wind, but with structure to it, with intention. And then I heard something else. Breathing, slow, rhythmic breathing from inside that shaft. Something large and patient, and aware that I was standing there, shining my light into its home. I pulled back and practically ran down the trail. I didn't stop until I reached the parking area. I didn't return to the Tetons. Instead, I drove to my hotel, packed my things, and drove through the night toward Utah. Zion Canyon was my next stop. The disappearances there had been concentrated on the Angel's Landing Trail and the Narrows area. I stayed for only one day, long enough to walk a portion of the Angel's Landing Trail and feel the same displaced geography, the same sense that I was being watched from beneath the stone itself. That night in a motel in Springdale, Utah, I realized something that made my hands shake. The disappearances weren't random. The locations weren't chosen arbitrarily. Someone or something was selecting parks, selecting locations with specific geological features, and waiting for hikers. The disappearances were feeding. They were hunger. And they were occurring along a path that seemed to follow the continent's geological bloodline, moving through areas of geothermal activity, ancient aquifers, places where the Earth was alive and connected in ways that modern geology didn't fully understand. The pattern was moving again. The most recent disappearances in the past 3 years had been concentrated in the southwest. But there was a clear movement northward. Colorado next, I thought. Then the Black Hills. Then north toward the Great Lakes. I had to understand what I was tracking before it moved again. I drove to Boulder and spent a week in the university's geology library. I found research papers on geothermal systems, on deep Earth circulation patterns, on cave systems that connected across greater distances than previously thought possible. I found a 1960s geological survey that mapped what it called thermal artery zones of geothermal activity that seemed to correlate in ways suggesting underground connection. The survey was old, incomplete, but it mapped remarkably precisely along the path the disappearances were following. I also found something else, a paper from 1952 by a geologist named Marcus Webb. The name stopped me cold. Marcus Webb, the hiker who disappeared in Yellowstone in 1987. I found his published work in the university archives. It was a theoretical paper about potential life forms in extreme deep Earth environments. Webb hypothesized that Earth's extreme thermal zones could harbor organisms adapted to intense heat and pressure, organisms that might have developed intelligently, in complete isolation from surface life. Her paper was widely dismissed at the time as science fiction masquerading as geology. Webb never published anything else. He disappeared from the academic world and became a parks ranger instead. 14 years later, as Marcus Webb the Ranger, he disappeared into those same extreme thermal zones he'd theorized about. I don't know if he found what he was looking for, or if what he was looking for found him. I was contemplating that question when I received an email from my work account. The subject line was blank. The message contained only one line: stop digging or disappear. FD was Foster, obviously. My supervisor. My warning. I called him immediately. You went to the parks, he said without preamble. You visited Yellowstone, the Tetons, Zion. You're asking questions of rangers. You're becoming a problem. What is it? I asked. What are we dealing with here? We're dealing with something that was here before the parks existed. Something that exists in the deep places, in the spaces where the Earth's heat and pressure create conditions hostile to surface life, something that has learned, over geological timescales, that surface life occasionally appears in places where it shouldn't. Hikers wandering into its domain, tourists descending into caves. I think it's learned to attract them. To call them, that's not possible, I said. But I didn't believe it anymore. It's not common, and it's not efficient, which is why it takes decades for disappearances to cluster, why it doesn't just kill everyone who visits these places. But it works. And the Park Service recognized long ago that we couldn't stop it, we could only manage it. By restricting access to certain areas, by maintaining very particular hiking policies, by burying the data, we minimize the number of people it attracts. It's a compromise with something we don't understand, and it's the best we can do. And Marcus Webb was a brilliant man who thought he understood the geology better than anyone. He was wrong. The line went dead. I didn't stop digging, but I became more careful. I worked from home, accessing the database through VPN, accessing research that was officially off limits. I focused on one thing, finding a pattern in how the disappearances occurred, in what separated victims from the thousands of hikers who passed through without incident. What I found was terrifying in its specificity. Every missing person had, at some point in their life, read or been exposed to geological research about deep Earth thermal systems. Every one of them had expressed, to someone, a curiosity about what lived in extreme environments. Every single one of them, when they disappeared, had been hiking alone or had deliberately separated from their group immediately before vanishing. They weren't being randomly selected. They were being called, and the thing doing the calling was recognizing in them something, a curiosity, a scientific interest, a particular pattern of thought that made them compatible with what it wanted to tell them, or show them, or take them to. I realized then what I had to do. For 8 years I'd kept my research separate from my work. I'd maintained the fiction that I was following Park Service protocol, while secretly pursuing something entirely different. But the discovery I'd just made required action. It required me to go to someone who would believe me and had the authority to do something about it. I chose Dr. Elena Vasquez, a researcher at the University of Colorado who'd written extensively about cave ecosystems and deep Earth geothermal science. I contacted her through official channels, framing it as the Park Service wanting to consult on cave access protocols, and arranged a meeting. She agreed to see me, but only after I'd mentioned specific disappearance cases. She'd been following them too. Vasquez's office was a controlled chaos of geological surveys, deep Earth maps, and research papers. She was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back severely, and eyes that seemed to have seen more than most people's eyes should. Foster said they'd send someone eventually, she said without preamble. I've been expecting it for 2 years, you know, I asked. I know more than the Park Service wants anyone to know. I've been studying deep Earth thermal corridors for 30 years, and about 15 years ago, I started recognizing patterns in the research patterns that suggested communication, not audible communication, thermal communication. Pressure waves through geothermal systems, something deep in the Earth's crust that's been signaling upward through these thermal zones for a very long time. She pulled out a map, heavily annotated. Look at this. These are the major geothermal zones in North America. Now look at where the disappearances are clustered. The overlap was nearly perfect. Every time someone with knowledge of deep Earth science gets close to these zones, there's an increased likelihood of disappearance. I think what's down there is seeking out intelligent life on the surface. It's calling to people who have the capacity to understand what it is. And I think it's been doing this for centuries, maybe longer. That's impossible, I said. That's impossible? She smiled sadly. We don't fully understand what exists in extreme deep Earth conditions. We've mapped less of Earth's subsurface than we've mapped the surface of the moon. There could be anything down there. There could be anything. Why hasn't this been exposed? Why hasn't anyone gone public? because the Park Service realized that public panic would be worse than the disappearances, and because the disappearances are rare enough that they can be managed, and because, she paused, choosing her words carefully, the thing that's calling doesn't want surface exposure. It actively discourages it. Anyone who gets too close to understanding it, anyone who threatens to expose it, tends to have accidents, early retirement, forced transfers, mysterious illnesses. The Park Service isn't hiding this to be cruel. They're hiding it because they've learned the hard way that keeping it hidden is the only way to keep it manageable. I left Vasquez's office with photocopies of her research and the knowledge that I was now officially compromised. If I continued working for the Park Service, I would be expected to help maintain the lie. If I stopped, I would become a liability. The choice was made for me when I arrived at my apartment and found Foster waiting in the hallway. "You need to resign," he said simply. "Tonight. The first send you documentation of voluntary termination. You'll receive a severance package and a legal agreement that prevents you from discussing your work with anyone outside the Park Service. You'll sign it or we'll pursue formal action. What if I refuse? Then you'll disappear. Not by choice, not randomly. You'll get an accident while hiking in a national park. You'll be in the wrong place at the right time. And when your body isn't found because it won't be, your research files will disappear too, and there won't be anyone left to ask questions about them." He wasn't making threats. He was describing protocol. I signed the papers that night, but I didn't stop. What I did instead was carefully extract my research, transfer it to encrypted files, and begin a process of systematic documentation. I contacted the few people who already knew Vasquez, and through her, several other researchers who'd come close to the truth. We built a network of people who understood what was happening and were committed to preventing it from being forgotten. For 2 years, nothing happened. I worked retail jobs. I lived quietly. I maintained my research without interfacing directly with the Park Service, but I was always aware that someone, somewhere, was watching me. Foster never contacted me again. The Park Service maintained appropriate distance, but there were small things. A hiker who seemed to be on the same trail as me whenever I visited parks. A car that appeared in different parking areas. The sense of being tracked by something that didn't want me to become a problem, but was monitoring whether I might. Then, in March 2024, I received a letter, no return address, handwritten. It contained only a question. Do you want to know what they're calling for? I should have destroyed it. I should have left it alone. Instead, I responded, following the instructions in the letter to a specific geocache in Rocky Mountain National Park. The geocache contained a detailed map, specific coordinates, and instructions to come alone at a specific time. It was a trap. Obviously. Almost certainly. I had no way to know if it was being set by Vasquez or by something else, something that had grown tired of being hidden and wanted to confront the one person still actively pursuing the truth about it. I went anyway. Rocky Mountain National Park at midnight in late March is a specific kind of cold, the kind of cold that makes you aware you're far from shelter, far from help, far from anything that could reasonably intervene if something went wrong. I parked at the designated trailhead and hiked upward with a flashlight and coordinates burned into my memory. The instructions said to follow a specific bearing until I reached a cairn, then descend into a ravine where I would find a cave entrance. The terrain was brutal steep, rocky, unstable. But I followed the bearing precisely, and 45 minutes into the hike, I found the cairn. It was new, built deliberately, made to be found. The cave entrance was exactly where the map indicated. I descended carefully, my flashlight creating shadows that seemed to move independently. The air grew warmer as I went deeper, and I began to smell it. The smell I'd encountered at other sites. Sulfur and age and something ancient. The cave opened into a chamber so large I couldn't find the ceiling with my flashlight. The temperature was increasing steadily, and I could hear something, that same sound I'd heard at Hidden Falls. Breathing. or wind, or something between the two. At the center of the chamber, there was a pool of water that glowed with its own faint bioluminescence. The glow was pale blue-green, and it seemed to pulse with rhythm, with intention. I approached the pool carefully. That's when I saw them. In the water, suspended below the surface, were figures. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. They weren't decomposed. They weren't bones. They were preserved in some kind of stasis, their bodies intact, their eyes open, their expressions caught between fear and something else. Fascination, wonder, understanding. They were the missing people, all of them, every disappearance from the past 40 years and more. And they weren't dead. They were being kept, being shown something. The water began to glow brighter, and I realized that something was becoming aware of me. Not just aware, actively reaching toward me through the water, through the rock, through the very air of the cave. I saw or understood something in that moment that I can't adequately describe. An intelligence that wasn't thinking in ways I could comprehend. A being that had spent geological ages in darkness and heat and pressure, that had learned to grow patient, to recognize kindred spirits among surface life people who wondered about the deep places, who were curious about extreme conditions, who had the particular type of mind that could appreciate what it had to show them. It wasn't evil. I don't think it was consciously hunting us. I think it was lonely, and it had learned that occasionally, when certain minds descended into its domain, it could share something with them. It could show them the beauty and terror of the deep earth. It could make them part of something vast and old and utterly alien. But they couldn't survive the transition. Their bodies could be preserved in its conditions, but their minds, their consciousness, couldn't remain intact in a space where they could comprehend what they were experiencing. So they were kept in stasis, alive but suspended, aware but unable to process awareness. The thing in the water was waiting for me to descend. It had brought me here specifically because I was the type of mind it wanted to keep. I had spent years pursuing the truth, years thinking about what lived in the deep places. I was exactly the kind of curious, obsessive consciousness it collected. I could see it now, rising through the water knot, a form exactly, but a mass of something that wasn't quite solid and wasn't quite liquid. It was reaching toward me, and I understood with perfect clarity that if I let it touch me, if I allowed contact, I would go down into that stasis with all the others, my body perfectly preserved, my mind forever trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. I ran back through that cave with my flashlight bouncing wildly, ran up the ravine without caution or consideration for terrain, ran until I burst out into the cold March night, and didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove 18 hours without stopping. I'm writing this now from a location I'm not going to identify, in a form I'm not going to release for publication. I'm recording what I know, because the disappearances are accelerating. In the past year alone, there have been 12 confirmed missing persons cases across national parks, all following the established pattern. The thing in the deep places is growing more active. It's learning more about how to call, how to select, how to preserve. The Park Service knows, Foster knows, Vasquez knows, and there's nothing any of us can do about it except manage it, contain it, maintain the necessary fiction that the national parks are safe as long as you stay on the trails and follow the rules. But I know the truth now, and I know that knowledge is itself a liability. The thing in the deep earth was waiting for me that night because it had already begun to call me, had already marked me as a compatible mind. And now, no matter where I go, no matter what I do, I can feel it calling. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and I'm not sure if the sound I'm hearing is wind or breathing. Sometimes I smell that smells sulfur and age and preservation for just a moment before it vanishes. Sometimes I find myself researching geothermal zones without remembering why I started, compiling information about deep earth thermal corridors with an obsessive focus I can't quite control. The Park Service wanted me to stop digging. I have. But the thing in the deep places is still digging, still reaching, still calling. And I'm beginning to wonder if, by learning the truth, I've already taken the first step into that cave. I wonder how long I have before I start looking at a map of national parks and feel an overwhelming need to visit a specific location. How long before a trail seems to call to me the way it calls to others? How long before I find myself separated from my group with no clear memory of deciding to be alone? How long before I answer the call? The Park Service never found anything wrong with the Ridgeline Trail records I mentioned in my opening. They continued to close and monitor certain areas based on disappearance clusters. And every year, a few more people vanish into the deep places beneath America's most beautiful destinations, their bodies preserved in impossible conditions, their minds touched by something that exists in the spaces between what we understand and what we fear to acknowledge. If you're reading this and you recognize the pattern, if you know someone who disappeared, if you felt the pull yourself, know that you're not imagining it. The parks are beautiful, but beneath the trails and the tourist overlooks and the ranger stations, something ancient and patient is reaching upward, looking for minds like ours. This is an original fictional horror story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental. I've spent 17 years studying large carnivores in the Rocky Mountains, and I've learned to trust what the data tells me. The data never lies. Animals follow patterns, territorial ranges, feeding behaviors, breeding cycles, and those patterns can be mapped, predicted, managed. But something in the high peaks of western Colorado stopped following any pattern I'd ever encountered, and by the time I realized how fundamentally wrong my assumptions were, the data had already started collecting human cost. My name is Dr. Sarah Reeves, and I study apex predators. My specialty is tracking large mammals, wolves, grizzlies, mountain lions, and understanding how their presence affects ecosystem stability. I work for a nonprofit called Apex Dynamics, and I've published papers on predator reintroduction, population management, and human-wildlife conflict resolution. I'm good at what I do. I'm meticulous. I follow protocol. I verify every piece of data before I draw conclusions. I should have listened to the parts of me that wanted to ignore the data. In March 2019, a backcountry ranger named Tom Helms reported unusual scat fecal matter collected from the Elk Range area northwest of Aspen. The samples were massive, far larger than anything grizzly or lion could produce, and the composition was anomalous. Rather than the typical carnivore scat containing fur and bone fragments, these samples contained something else, what appeared to be plant material, but in quantities and combinations that didn't match any herbivore diet. Tom forwarded the samples to my lab with a note. "This doesn't match anything I know. Wanted your opinion." I ran the samples through our standard analysis protocol. The results were inconclusive. The material was definitely mammalian in origin, definitely from a predator based on trace evidence of meat consumption, but the primary content was decidedly plant-based. Roots, seeds, and something that didn't match any plant species in our database. I should have filed it as contamination and moved on. Instead, I became curious. I drove up to the Elk Range the following week. It was late March, snow still heavy on the ground, the high peaks completely inaccessible. Tom met me at a ranger station in a small town called Marble, and we drove to the collection site. He showed me where he'd found the scat, several locations clustered within about a quarter-mile radius, all at relatively high elevation, all in areas that would be difficult for a conventional hiker to access. "I've been coming to these mountains for 30 years, Tom said as we hiked. "I've seen grizzly scat that could make your hair stand on end, lion kills that look like crime scenes, but I've never seen anything like this. And there's more. I found these too. He showed me photographs on his phone. Claw marks, deeply embedded in granite rock. The marks were arranged in a pattern that suggested a climbing motion, but the depth and width suggested something massive. A grizzly's claw is roughly 2 inches. These marks were at least 4 inches across, and they'd scored the stone as if the creature had dragged something incredibly heavy or incredibly powerful across the rock face. How is that possible? I asked. I have no idea. That's why I called you. We spent 3 days at the site, collecting additional samples, documenting the claw marks, and setting up motion-activated trail cameras. The cameras captured nothing. No animals passed the collection zones during our observation period. But we found more evidence. Trees with bark stripped to heights of at least 10 feet, stripped in a pattern that suggested deliberate feeding rather than rubbing or territorial marking. We found what appeared to be a den site, a cave, opening at high elevation that contained recent use evidence, though whatever had been using it hadn't left visible traces. The air around the den smelled wrong. There's a specific smell to predator dens, musky, feral, but ultimately recognizable. This smell was different. It was acrid, almost chemical, with an undertone of something rotting. I collected samples from inside the cave and sent them for analysis. I also submitted the plant material and the claw mark photographs to colleagues at universities across the West. The responses I received ranged from skepticism to genuine confusion. Nobody recognized the plant material. Nobody had seen claw marks that matched this pattern exactly. One response, from a cryptozoologist at the University of Montana named Dr. Richard Vance, was different from the others. He wrote, "I've seen similar evidence from 3 other locations in the northern Rockies. Not the same claw marks, but similar characteristics. Similar scat composition. The creature or creatures may be more widespread than your initial collection suggests. I'd like to discuss this further." I called him immediately. We spent 4 hours on the phone discussing his findings, and by the end of the conversation, I'd made the decision that would change my entire understanding of the Rocky Mountains. Richard had been documenting evidence of what he believed was an unknown large primate for nearly a decade, not the traditional Bigfoot or Sasquatch that cryptozoologists pursued, but something different, something with characteristics that suggested it was highly adapted to extreme mountain environments, something that left evidence of intelligence in its behavior patterns. He had similar scat samples, similar claw marks, and something else, acoustic recordings of vocalizations that didn't match any known animal. He sent me the recordings, and I listened to them in my office at midnight, alone, with my door locked. The sounds were unlike anything I'd ever heard. They were low frequency, below the range of most human perception, but audible enough to create physical sensation, a vibration in the chest, a feeling of displacement in the ears. But underneath the low tone was something else, a pattern that suggested speech, modulation, intent. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next 3 months, I became obsessed. I organized expeditions into the Elk Range, the San Juan Mountains, and the Sangre de Cristo Range. I collected samples, documented evidence, set up acoustic monitoring equipment. I told my colleagues I was studying recent predator activity. I didn't tell them I was hunting something that shouldn't exist. The evidence accumulated. In June, I found partial tracks in high-altitude soil footprints that suggested a bipedal gait, prints that were massive, roughly 16 inches long, and arranged in a pattern that implied conscious navigation of difficult terrain. In July, I collected hair samples from rocks near a possible den site. The hair was dark brown, very coarse, and didn't match any known animal species in the database. I submitted the hair for DNA analysis. The results came back inconclusive. The DNA contained markers that aligned with primates, but with significant divergence. The lab technician suggested contamination, but the sample was clean. She suggested database error, but the equipment was calibrated. She suggested that the sample came from an animal that wasn't in the modern genetic database, which meant either an extinct species or an unknown one. "You need to report this," Richard said when I called him with the results. "This is proof of an unknown species. This is major." Proof to whom? I asked. If I go public with this without being absolutely certain, I destroy my credibility. I destroy my career. And I still don't have a complete specimen, not even a good photograph. Then collect one. Capture an unknown primate? Richard, I know it's dangerous. I know it's ethically complicated. But some behavior to avoid human contact. He was right, and I hated that he was right. The scientific process demanded evidence, and the only evidence that would satisfy the academic community was a specimen, either a complete skeleton or, preferably, a living animal that could be studied. I began planning an expedition for September, when the weather would still permit high-altitude work, but when the creatures, if they existed, in the numbers the evidence suggested, might be more active as they prepared for hibernation or migration. That's when everything became urgent. In late August, a hiker named Michael Reeves disappeared on Bear Mountain, part of the Elk Range. His body was found 3 days later by search and rescue, but the circumstances were bizarre. He had been found at an elevation and location that made no sense. He'd been hiking a mid-range trail that topped out at about 11,000 feet, but his body was found at 12,500 feet in terrain that would require serious climbing experience to access. His remains showed signs of trauma, though the official report was vague about details. Multiple injuries, consistent with fall or predation by large carnivore. Cause of death, massive trauma. The report didn't mention what I noticed in the photographs, the pattern of the injuries. They weren't the random damage of a fall or the characteristic trauma of predation. The damage was precise, almost surgical. Multiple deep lacerations in a specific pattern, distributed across the body in a way that suggested something with multiple points of contact, something that had deliberately inflicted injury. 2 weeks later, another hiker went missing from the Maroon Bells area, a woman named Jennifer Chow, last seen by her hiking partner, who'd turned back with altitude sickness, while Cho wanted to continue. Chow wasn't found for nearly a week, and when she was, the same pattern of injuries was evident. The Park Service called in a specialist, a biologist from Denver, who suggested the injuries could be consistent with a mountain lion attack. Though the pattern was unusual, media coverage intensified, warnings were issued, people were advised to hike in groups and carry bear spray. But Richard and I knew better. The kills are becoming less cautious, Richard said when we spoke after Cho's body was found. The first one could be explained away as a bear or a predation event. The second confirms a pattern. They're not afraid of humans anymore. They're hunting us. You don't know that, I said, but I was already packing equipment for a field expedition. We don't know enough to make that claim. We know enough to know that 2 people are dead, and whatever is responsible is escalating. I organized what I called a population assessment expedition, but what was actually a hunt. I selected a team of 6 people, myself, Richard, 2 wilderness guides named Marcus and Kate, a wildlife veterinarian named Dr. Patricia Huang, and Tom Helms, the ranger who'd first reported the scat. We established a base camp at about 10,000 feet in a remote valley, accessible only by helicopter. We set up acoustic monitoring equipment, placed remote cameras at every location where we'd found evidence, and established a perimeter with motion sensors. We were going to gather data on the creature's behavior, population size, and movement patterns. What we actually gathered was an understanding of something that human science wasn't equipped to comprehend. The first night at base camp, the acoustic equipment detected vocalizations at multiple points around our perimeter. The sounds were the low-frequency tones Richard had recorded, but layered multiple voices calling to each other, creating patterns that suggested communication. The vocalizations formed sequences that repeated, then varied slightly, then repeated again. Structure, language, possibly. How many individuals do you estimate? Patricia asked, listening to the playback. At least 4, Richard said. Probably more. These are just the ones vocalizing at this moment. We're surrounded, Marcus said quietly. He was right. The sounds were coming from all directions, north, south, east, west. Whatever these creatures were, they had positioned themselves around our camp, and they were aware of our presence. They're testing us, I said. Establishing communication, assessing the threat level, or hurting us, Kate suggested. Predators do that. Separate prey from escape routes, assess capability, then attack. We stayed alert all night, but nothing approached the camp. The vocalizations continued for about 3 hours, then stopped. By dawn, the creatures had moved off, their positions indicated by distant motion sensor triggers. Over the next week, we documented what appeared to be organized behavior. The creatures maintained a loose perimeter around our camp, never approaching directly, but present, watching. The acoustic data revealed increasing complexity in their vocalizations' new patterns, what seemed like responses to our movements, possibly even attempts to mimic human speech. On the third night, the equipment recorded a sound that was unmistakably human, in origin a woman's voice saying, "Help me," repeated 17 times before stopping abruptly. "That's impossible," Patricia said, reviewing the recording. "That's an exact recording of human speech." "That's not an animal sound. They're mimics," Richard said. "Advanced vocal mimicry. Or they're smart enough to understand that human vocalizations might bring us out of the camp." The next morning, Tom discovered something that changed everything. He'd been collecting water samples from a stream about a quarter-mile from camp when he found what appeared to be clothing scraps of fabric caught on rocks in the water, along with something else, human hair, and beneath it residue that appeared to be bone. The fabric was identified as matching Jennifer Cho's last known clothing. We doubled our security that day. We reinforced the camp perimeter, set up additional monitoring, and established a watch rotation. Patricia wanted to leave immediately, to call for helicopter evacuation, and report our findings to authorities. "We can't leave," I said. "If we run, we lose our chance to document this. We lose everything. We lose our lives if we stay," Patricia shot back. "This isn't about data collection anymore, Sarah. These things have killed at least 2 people, and they're intelligent enough to hunt strategically. We're not researchers anymore. We're prey." That night, they came. The attack wasn't sudden or chaotic. It was coordinated and deliberate. The motion sensors triggered simultaneously at multiple points around the perimeter, and we heard them, massive shapes moving through the darkness, vocalizations that formed a pattern, a strategy. But they didn't rush the camp. Instead, they attacked the equipment. The motion sensors were torn from their mounts. The acoustic equipment was smashed. The remote cameras were pulled from trees and destroyed. They were systematically eliminating our ability to document their presence, destroying evidence with what appeared to be complete understanding of what the equipment did. We fired flares, we sounded air horns, we made noise and light, and all the things designed to frighten away predators, and they retreated, but not far. They moved to the edge of the firelight and waited. That's when I saw one clearly. It emerged from the darkness at the perimeter of our campfire, and my mind couldn't quite process what I was seeing. Bipedal, but with proportions that were wrong: limbs too long, torso too compact, arms that hung down to almost mid-thigh. The creature was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, but the face was the nightmare. It was almost human, but stretched, distorted, with a cranial structure that was both primate and something else. The eyes were enormous and caught the firelight like a canine's, glowing red-orange. But they held intelligence. Deliberate, focused intelligence. It looked directly at me, and I felt something shift in my perception of reality. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't a lion. This was something that should not exist. Something that violated every principle of mammalian biology I'd ever learned. Something that was looking at me with an expression that suggested it was making decisions about my continued existence. Then, it opened its mouth and produced a sound that was almost human. A growl that modulated into something approaching speech. A vocalization that seemed to attempt the structure of language before abandoning the effort and returning to something more bestial. Tom fired his rifle. The shot was loud, echoing across the valley. The creature didn't react with the startled response a normal animal would show. Instead, it seemed to evaluate the event, acknowledge it, and then simply turn and walk back into the darkness. The other creatures I could now see, there were at least 5 of them at the perimeter, followed, their vocalizations creating a pattern that suggested communication about what had just occurred. We evacuated at dawn. I called for helicopter extraction, claiming medical emergency. and we were airlifted out within 6 hours. Nobody on the Park Service side questioned the evacuation too closely. They were already dealing with the social pressure of 2 hiker deaths in 2 weeks. An additional incident with a researcher would have been unmanageable, but I had evidence. I had acoustic recordings, photographs, collected samples, and eyewitness testimony from 6 trained observers. I had everything needed to prove the existence of an unknown species. I also had the certainty that nobody would believe me. I spent 3 months writing a technical paper detailing my findings. I submitted it to peer-reviewed journals. Every single one rejected it. The comments ranged from professional skepticism to outright dismissal. Contamination of samples, misidentification of known species, insufficient evidence. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. The acoustic data was dismissed as equipment malfunction. The footage from the cameras that survived was called inconclusive. The hair samples were suggested to be contaminated or misidentified. The scat analysis was challenged as potentially from known species with anomalous composition. Richard submitted a paper through the Journal of Cryptozoology. It was published, but it was immediately attacked by mainstream science as fringe research, as the kind of work that was more entertainment than actual science. By December, I was professionally isolated. My colleagues whispered about the expedition. Some suggested I'd fabricated the evidence. Others suggested I'd simply misidentified normal animals and allowed misinterpretation to become obsession. My nonprofit's board began quietly suggesting that I take some time off, perhaps reconsider my research direction. I didn't stop researching. I just stopped sharing my findings with anyone who might be publicly compromised by them. Over the next year, I monitored reports from the Rocky Mountains obsessively. Missing hikers, unexplained deaths, unusual animal attacks. I documented everything. The pattern was becoming clear. The creature population was spreading. Evidence was appearing not just in Colorado, but in Wyoming, Montana, New Mexico. The distribution was widening, the frequency of incidents increasing. By the summer of 2021, there had been 14 confirmed deaths that matched the pattern deaths officially attributed to falls, animal attacks, or accidents, but which shared characteristics that no natural animal could explain. I began contacting the families of the deceased. Most didn't want to talk to me, but a few did. A mother who'd lost her son in Glacier National Park. A husband who'd lost his wife in the Wind Rivers. They wanted to know what had killed their loved ones. They wanted answers that the official reports couldn't provide. I gave them the truth, or what I'd come to believe was the truth. The creature existed. Creatures, plural. They were intelligent. They were learning human behavior. They were becoming more efficient predators. And official agencies knew something was wrong but were covering it up, because acknowledging the existence of an unknown apex predator in America's wilderness would cause panic. That last part was the dangerous part, because once I started saying it to grieving families, once I started suggesting there was a cover-up, I became someone else entirely. I became a threat to the narrative that kept people feeling safe. The first warning came via email from someone identifying as a Park Service official. The message was brief: stop contacting families of deceased hikers and making claims about unknown predators. Future contact will result in legal action for defamation. I ignored it. The second warning was more personal. I found my research files had been accessed without authorization, not destroyed, but clearly reviewed. The message was implicit: we know what you know, and we're watching. The third warning was direct. A Park Service supervisor named Gerald Matthews requested a meeting with me in Denver. I went, expecting confrontation. What I got was something more unsettling: an offer. We'd like to hire you as a consulting contractor, Matthews said calmly, to help manage the situation in the high country. Your salary would be substantial. Your work would be classified, but it would make a real difference in managing the public safety crisis we're facing. You're admitting there's a crisis. We're admitting that we have an unprecedented challenge that requires expertise. We'd prefer to solve it quietly, with your help, rather than see you continue making claims publicly that will cause unnecessary panic. It was a bribing offer wrapped in professional language. Stop talking publicly, work for us privately, help us deal with something we can't acknowledge, and you get paid, and your career is salvaged. What if I refuse? Then you'll continue to be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. Your research will remain unpublished. You'll be professionally isolated, and will quietly suggest to your nonprofit that accepting more of your grant work would be problematic for their reputation. He wasn't threatening violence. He didn't need to. He was threatening something worse: irrelevance. The erasure of my credibility, the isolation of my voice, the slow destruction of everything I'd built. I accepted the contract. For the past 3 years, I've worked as a classified consultant for the National Park Service, helping to develop strategies to minimize human-cryptid interactions, to restrict access to high-risk areas, and to manage the growing number of incidents. The work is grim. We document every attack, every kill, every interaction with the creatures. We map their territories, track their movement patterns, and try to predict where they'll strike next. What I've learned in this classified work is that the creatures are spreading rapidly. The population has grown from what we estimated at 30 to 50 individuals in 2019 to over 300 documented individuals across the Rocky Mountain Range in 2024. They're learning. They're evolving their hunting strategies. They're becoming more efficient predators, and they're starting to coordinate with each other in ways that suggest not just intelligence, but culture. Learned behavior passing between individuals, teaching of young by adults, use of tools in limited forms. They're not mindless predators. They're not animals in any conventional sense. They're something new, something that shouldn't exist in a world where we've cataloged every large predator, where we know every species that exceeds 500 pounds in body weight. They're an impossibility that exists, documented but hidden, real but officially non-existent. The cover-up continues because the alternative public knowledge of an unknown apex predator spreading across the continent is unthinkable. It would destroy the outdoor recreation industry. It would cause panic. It would demand government resources and military response. It's easier to let people die quietly, to attribute deaths to accidents, to slowly restrict access to wilderness areas under the guise of conservation. But the creatures know we know they exist, and they're becoming bolder. Last month, one of them walked into a ranger station in Wyoming, not to attack to be seen. It stood in the doorway, looked directly at the ranger on duty, vocalized something that sounded almost like speech, and then walked away. It was witnessed by multiple people. We contained the story as an equipment malfunction, a case of misidentification, a ranger having a breakdown. But the creature had made its point. They know we're trying to hide them. They know we're trying to restrict access to the wilderness. And they don't care. They're going to continue spreading, continue hunting, continue proving that in the high places of the Rocky Mountains, we are not apex predators anymore. I've stopped believing that this situation can be managed through secrecy. The creatures are too intelligent, too numerous, too adaptive. Eventually, they'll be seen by too many people to hide. Eventually, the truth will break free. What concerns me more is what happens when the world learns what the Park Service has known for 5 years, that we've let the creatures spread unchecked because acknowledging them was inconvenient, that we've prioritized public comfort over public safety, that people have died because we decided it was more important to protect tourism than to warn hikers of a genuine documented threat. I think about the families I contacted, the parents and spouses who wanted to know what killed their loved ones. I think about the hikers who still go into the mountains, trusting official assurances that the wilderness is safe, not understanding that they're walking into territory claimed by something that has learned to hunt us. and I think about that creature in the firelight, looking directly at me, making a choice about my continued existence. I wonder if, in making my peace with the cover-up, in accepting the contract and the silence, I made myself complicit in future deaths. I'm writing this as a record, not for publication, it's too dangerous, but as a document that should exist, that proves someone knew, that documents what was covered up and why. This record will be sealed away, given to someone with instructions to release it only if certain conditions occur, if the cover-up breaks, if the incidents become undeniable, if the official narrative finally fails. Until then, the creatures remain hidden, not from the wilderness, but from public consciousness. They spread through the high peaks, learn new hunting strategies, teach their young to see humans as prey, and we continue the charade that the Rocky Mountains are safe places, that hiking is a reasonable recreational activity, that nothing is fundamentally wrong with a land where science has failed and reality has become something we simply can't acknowledge. The creatures know the truth, and the very worst part is this: they're not hiding from us anymore. They're waiting, watching how long we can maintain the lie, anticipating the moment when the fiction finally breaks. When it does, they'll be ready. This is an original, fictional horror story, created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental. The town of Millbrook, Arkansas, no longer appears on most maps, and the official records of what happened there in 1907 were destroyed in what authorities claimed was an accidental fire at the county courthouse in 1952. I know this because I spent 3 years trying to find those records, and what I discovered instead was testimony that someone had worked very hard to make sure nobody could verify the historical truth of that year. I am writing this account as a scholar of Arkansas history, and I am writing it now because I finally understand why the truth was buried, and why it has remained buried for more than a century. My name is Dr. Michael Foster, and I teach American history at the University of Arkansas. My specialty is the social history of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly the stories of small towns during periods of economic change. Millbrook was one of these towns, a railroad stop that had experienced significant prosperity in the 1890s before the rail company redirected its main line in leaving the town to slowly decline. By 1907, Millbrook had a population of roughly 800 people, most of them involved in agriculture or small business dependent on the agricultural economy. But in the summer of 1907, something occurred in Millbrook that caused the entire town to be effectively sealed off from outside contact for 3 months. Newspapers in nearby cities reported rumors of plague, civil unrest, and mass hysteria. The railroad refused to route trains through Millbrook Station. The county sheriff maintained a perimeter around the town and turned away all travelers. And when the isolation was finally lifted in September 1907, the population of Millbrook had decreased by approximately 35%. The official explanation was disease. A cholera outbreak, the reports said. Rapid spread, high fatality rate, requiring complete quarantine. But the medical records that would have documented such an outbreak were among the records destroyed in the 1952 fire, and the survivors who left Millbrook after the quarantine was lifted refused to discuss what had happened. I became interested in Millbrook during my doctoral research, when I came across a reference to the town in a 1908 letter written by a public health official to the state capitol. The letter mentioned concerns about the official cholera explanation and suggested that the situation in Millbrook had been something other than a natural disease outbreak. The letter was vague, carefully worded, but it contained a specific phrase that lodged itself in my mind. The phenomenon was not of natural origin. For a scholar, that phrase was irresistible. I began trying to locate survivors or descendants of Millbrook residents who might have documentation or family memories of the event. It took me 18 months to find my first viable interview subject, an elderly woman named Margaret Thorne, whose grandmother had lived in Millbrook in 1907. Margaret's grandmother had kept a diary which Margaret had inherited. She had never shared it publicly, she told me when I called her, because the family had made a pact of silence about the summer of 1907. "But I'm old now," she said, "and my daughter doesn't want it, and I think maybe it's time someone knew the truth. Not for publication, just for the record. I need to know that someone will understand what happened, even if nobody else ever does." I drove to her home in Little Rock on a cold March afternoon in 2011. Margaret lived in a small house filled with the accumulated weight of family history, photographs, quilts, and books everywhere. She made me tea and brought out a journal bound in dark leather, its pages yellowed and brittle. The journal belonged to Margaret's grandmother, Catherine Malone, who had been 18 years old in the summer of 1907 and living in Millbrook with her family. The first entry relevant to the mystery was dated June 14, 1907. "Papa says there is something wrong with the earth this year. The well water tastes of minerals, though it has always been sweet before. The livestock refuse to drink from the creek. Mama thinks it is the heat, but I watched the creek this morning, and the water seems darker than usual, almost oily in appearance, though when I touched it, my hand came away clean. Something is changing." The entries continued over the following weeks, documenting a slow but undeniable shift in the natural world around Millbrook. Crops grew in abnormal patterns. Trees in the forest beyond the town began to shed leaves, despite it being summer. Birds abandoned the area entirely. The creek that ran through Millbrook gradually changed color, from clear to a faint amber, and eventually to a murky brown. Then came the entry, dated July 3, 1907. "The children have begun to see the Watchers." I stopped reading and looked up at Margaret. "Watchers? That's what Catherine called them. Read on." The entry continued. 3 children reported seeing people standing in the fields at night, figures that did not move, that watched the town from the edges. The children described them as very still, very thin, and possessed of an unusual height. Sheriff Blackwood investigated and found nothing, but last night Margaret Caldwell saw one from her bedroom window. She screamed, and by the time her parents reached the window, the figure was gone. But Margaret insists it was real. She describes it as wearing old clothes from decades past. Sheriff Blackwood has ordered people not to speak of the matter, as it will cause panic. Over the following 2 weeks, more people reported seeing the figures. The accounts were consistent: tall, thin, unnaturally still, dressed in what appeared to be outdated clothing. They stood in fields, appeared in forests, and watched the town from various distances. Whenever someone approached them or attempted to investigate, they would retreat deeper into the wilderness. Catherine's entry for July 19 noted, "Papa forbids me from discussing the Watchers, but everyone in town knows they are there. The sheriff has deputized several men to patrol at night. I overheard Papa and Mr. Caldwell discussing it in the study. Mr. Caldwell said he recognized one of the figures. He said it wore a coat identical to one his father wore 40 years ago, and that the face was similar to his father's face, though it could not possibly be. Papa told him to be silent, that such talk would only encourage hysteria." The situation in Millbrook escalated dramatically on July 24. Catherine wrote, "There has been an incident. A man named Thomas Gaines went into the forest to hunt. He did not return. Search parties went looking for him this morning and found no trace, but they did find evidence that something had dug extensively in the earth, in an area where the ground had collapsed years ago after the old well was sealed. The digging was recent. The earth was still loose. Over the following days, more people began to disappear. Young people, mostly, though not exclusively. The disappearances happened at night or in the early morning. People would leave their homes or be found to have left during the night and would not return. Search parties would find disturbed earth, evidence of digging, and what Catherine described as a terrible smell, like earth mixed with something ancient and wrong. By August 1, the town was in full panic. Catherine's entry for that date was brief. The sheriff has declared martial law. Nobody is permitted to leave their homes after dark. He has also decreed that anyone who discusses the Watchers or who attempts to leave Millbrook will be arrested and held. He says the army is coming. He says there is something wrong with the ground beneath the town and that scientists from the state are coming to investigate. But the army never came. The scientists never arrived. What arrived instead was silence. The railroad ceased all service through Millbrook. Telegraph and mail service was suspended. The town was cut off completely. Catherine's entries became more sporadic and more frightened. On August 5, Papa says we must remain calm. He says the situation is temporary, that the authorities have everything under control. But I saw him loading a rifle. I saw Miss S. Caldwell packing clothing as if preparing to flee. Something is going to happen. Something terrible is going to happen. August 8. The digging has spread. It is not only in the forest now. They are digging beneath the town itself. At night we hear the sounds. The earth shakes. Things beneath us are moving. The Watchers no longer simply watch. They are working toward something. Working to reach something. August 10. I saw one of the Watchers today. In full daylight. I was at the well, and it stood not 50 yards away, in the field where the Hartley farm used to be. It was thin, impossibly thin, and its clothes were in tatters, but its face was not wrong in the way you would expect. It was almost human, almost, but not quite. The eyes were ancient, the mouth opened, and it made a sound like wind through a cave. It did not move toward me. It simply watched. I was not afraid until I realized something. It was smiling. The final entries in Catherine's diary were brief, nearly incoherent with fear. They have found something in the earth. The diggers have found something. There is a structure beneath Millbrook, something artificial, something that was built long ago and has been sealed for centuries. The ground has split open in 3 locations. We can hear sounds coming from below, sounds like voices or like wind through passages. The townspeople are gathering. They are taking weapons. Sheriff Blackwood is saying, we must seal the openings, must collapse the passages, must prevent whatever is down there from emerging. The final entry was dated August 17. It is done. We sealed it. But at the cost. So many are gone, taken by the Watchers, pulled into the earth, into those passages. The diggers have stopped digging now. The Watchers have disappeared. But something has changed in the earth beneath us. Something has changed in the very air of Millbrook. Sheriff Blackwood is giving orders to evacuate the town, to abandon it entirely. He says there are things beneath Millbrook that should have remained sealed forever, and that we were foolish to think we could simply collapse the entrances and return to our lives. He says we must leave and never return, and never speak of what was found. Catherine's final entry was on August 19. We are leaving today. I do not know where we are going. Papa says we will tell people it was cholera, that we fled to escape disease. Nobody must know the truth. This diary must be hidden. If anyone ever learns what truly happened in Millbrook, the first pray they understand why we fled, why we were silent, why we chose to bury this mystery, rather than expose it to a world that would not believe us anyway. I finished reading the diary and set it down carefully on Margaret's table. I was shaking. My grandmother never spoke of it again, Margaret said quietly. Not to anyone. Her husband never knew the full story. Her children were never told. The pact of silence held. But she kept the diary hidden, and she gave it to my mother with instructions to give it to me, and with a message that someone should someday know the truth. in case the truth was ever needed. Why tell me? I asked. Why now? Because something is changing again, Margaret said. My daughter lives in Millbrook. I was confused. Millbrook isn't inhabited anymore. It's a ghost town, is it? Margaret pulled out her phone and showed me a photograph. A small town, clearly restored, with businesses operating, cars parked along streets. It's been rediscovered, she said. About 20 years ago, investors realized the location had historical value. They carefully restored it, brought in new residents. Now it's a tourist destination, living history. People tour the town, eat at restaurants, spend the night in bed and breakfast inns. It's become fashionable. And your daughter lives there. She manages a shop there. She moved there 6 years ago. And last month, she called me. She said the town was changing. She said the water from the wells tasted wrong again. She said there were people appearing at the edges of town, standing and watching. She said they were dressed in old clothes, and they moved in ways that didn't seem quite natural. She said she was frightened, and she wanted to know what I knew about Millbrook's history. I felt the weight of Catherine's words across the century. Did you tell her? I told her to leave, but she said she couldn't. She said she had a lease. She said the investors wouldn't allow the town to close. She said that Millbrook was too valuable as a historical attraction to abandon. I wanted to tell Margaret that her daughter was overreacting, that Catherine's diary was a historical artifact from a time of poor medical understanding and mass hysteria, that the watchers and the digging and the sealed structure were all products of fear and misinterpretation. But I had spent enough time studying history, studying how quickly rational people can rationalize extraordinary phenomena, to know that was almost certainly wrong. I asked Margaret if I could have copies of the diary entries. She agreed, and I spent the next 6 hours photographing every page. When I left her home that afternoon, I had documentation of something that should have been impossible, evidence of an historical event that had been deliberately erased from the record. I began researching the Millbrook mystery with an obsession that my colleagues would later describe as unhealthy. I tracked down other survivors' descendants. I found a 1908 newspaper article from the Arkansas Gazette that mentioned the Millbrook situation. Though it was extremely vague, following the unfortunate disease outbreak, citizens of Millbrook have chosen to disperse. The town is not expected to be repopulated in the near future. I requested the 1907 county records and was informed they had been destroyed. I requested the 1907 sheriff's reports and was told they were inaccessible. I tried to find records of the people who disappeared and discovered that documentation of them had been systematically removed from census data and death records. It was as if the 30 or more people who vanished from Millbrook in August 1907 had been actively erased from history. Then I did something that probably qualified as obsessive behavior beyond normal scholarly research. I drove to Millbrook. The town was exactly as Margaret had described, restored, charming, filled with tourists wandering along Main Street, looking at antique shops and eating at cafes. It was a beautiful place, the kind of small town that had been lost to history and then reclaimed by people who wanted to preserve a version of it, except the version they had reclaimed was a lie. I rented a room at the Millbrook Inn, a bed and breakfast located in what had apparently been the town's largest residence in the original era. The owner, a cheerful woman named Patricia, gave me a tour of the property and provided me with a detailed history of how the town had been restored. It's fascinating, Patricia said, because we have so little actual documentation about Millbrook's decline. The 1900 census shows about 800 people. The 1910 census shows about 500. So there was clearly significant population loss, but it's not well documented why. Most historians assume it was economic, related to the railroad rerouting. Did you ever find any documentation about disease? I asked carefully. Patricia laughed. Not really. There's a vague mention in one newspaper from 1908 about a cholera scare, but nothing detailed. No death records, no medical records, nothing. It's one of the mysteries of Millbrook's history, actually. The gap in the records is almost suspicious. That night, alone in my room, I sat by the window and watched the town. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where nothing seemed wrong. But Catherine's diary had taught me to look for subtle signs. I noticed that not many people were outside after dark. I noticed that the town had more security cameras than seemed necessary for a small tourist attraction. I noticed that some of the historic buildings had ground-level windows that were sealed, as if deliberately closed off. And I noticed, at the edge of the town, near the forest, figures standing motionless in the darkness. They were too far away to see clearly, just silhouettes, but they were there, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I made inquiries about the town's archaeology. Had there been any excavations? Any surveys of the ground? Any investigations into pre-existing structures? Patricia hesitated before answering. There were some survey teams here about 15 years ago, when the restoration was being planned, but the survey was cut short. Something about geological instability. The investors decided the safety concerns weren't worth it and didn't conduct further investigation. Geological instability? I pressed. Can you describe it? It was something about the subsurface. Apparently, there were cavities in the bedrock, cave systems or something. The structural engineers were concerned about building on unstable ground, but the investors got an exemption, probably paid off someone, and started the restoration anyway. I felt cold. Catherine's diary had mentioned a sealed structure beneath Millbrook. And now, a century later, when the town was being restored, there was evidence of cave systems, of cavities in the bedrock, of structural instability. The structure had not remained sealed. I spent the rest of my time in Millbrook, asking careful questions and observing. I learned that the town did have deep wells, and that the water from those wells had a strange mineral taste that the residents seemed to tolerate, but that disturbed visitors. I learned that occasionally, tourists reported seeing people standing in the fields near town, people who seemed to disappear when approached. I learned that the turnover rate for residents was unusually high, that people moved to Millbrook and left after a few months, often giving vague explanations about the atmosphere or just not fitting in. On my third night in Millbrook, I heard digging sounds coming from beneath the inn. They were faint, audible mostly through the floorboards, rhythmic and deliberate. The sounds of earth being moved, of tunneling, of excavation happening below the surface of the town. When I went downstairs to ask Patricia about it, she looked frightened. You heard it too? She asked. Yes. What is it? We don't talk about it, she said. It's been happening for about 2 years. At night, mostly. The sound of digging, of something moving in the passages beneath the town. We've brought in engineers and surveyors, but they can't find the source. They say it might be groundwater or settling, but I know what digging sounds like. That's not natural. Have you tried to stop it? To investigate? Patricia's expression was resigned. The investors told us not to investigate. They said that looking too deeply into the subsurface could cause the structural issues to worsen. They said we should ignore it. So we ignore it. That night, I packed my belongings and left Millbrook. I drove for 8 hours without stopping, and I didn't sleep properly for a week afterward. I have spent the intervening years researching the Millbrook mystery through academic channels. I've connected with historians, archaeologists, and geologists who have studied similar phenomena. What I have come to believe is this: Millbrook was built on top of an ancient site. Beneath the town, there is or was a structure of unknown origin, possibly created by a pre-Columbian civilization, possibly something older than that. This structure had been sealed at some point in the distant past, but the seal was not permanent. Over time, forces beneath the earth worked to reopen it, to disturb the seal, to restore access. In 1907, the seal was beginning to fail. The watchers that Catherine described were something that emerged or was released when the structure beneath Millbrook began to open. They were not entirely human, not entirely natural, and they existed to accomplish something specific, to fully restore access to the sealed structure. The people of Millbrook were not victims of cholera. They were taken, pulled into the passages, into the structure that lay beneath their town, drawn there by something that recognized in them a quality it required. 35 people, taken across a single month, while the townspeople desperately tried to seal the openings and prevent further incursions. In the end, they succeeded in sealing the structure again, but they paid a tremendous cost, and they learned a fundamental truth that Sheriff Blackwood understood. Some things, once opened, can never truly be closed. A century later, the seal is failing again. The restoration of Millbrook was not an accident. At some point in the 1990s, investors identified the town as an opportunity. They brought in workers. They began restoration, and in doing so, they disturbed the sealed entrances to the structure beneath. The digging that began in 2006 was not human digging, despite what the locals tell themselves. It was the structure opening itself again, or being opened by whatever exists in the passages below. Margaret's daughter left Millbrook 3 months ago. She moved to Texas and will not return. She told me, when I finally contacted her, that she had begun to dream of the passages. Dreams of walking through tunnels carved in ancient stone, of reaching a chamber that was simultaneously natural cave and carefully constructed space, of seeing things in that chamber that made her scream without sound. She said she was afraid that if she stayed in Millbrook much longer, the dreams would stop being dreams. I have submitted my research to academic journals and had it rejected on the grounds that it was speculation rather than provable history. I have written a book that no mainstream publisher will touch. I have presented my findings at historical conferences and been politely dismissed as pursuing a conspiracy theory. So I am releasing this account now, in this form, with full understanding that most people will not believe it. But the truth is that Millbrook is opening again. The investors will continue their restoration efforts. Tourism will increase. More people will be drawn to the town, attracted by its history and charm and the strange sense that something important once happened there. And when it cannot be denied or concealed, there will be nothing to stop what comes after. The mystery of 1907 was not resolved, it was merely postponed, and the postponement is ending. If you visit Millbrook, and if you hear the digging sounds beneath the earth at night, if you see the figures standing at the edges of town, if you feel drawn to the forest beyond the settled area, remember Catherine Malone's words, something is changing in the very air of Millbrook. Remember that in 1907, people fled because they understood the truth. And remember that the truth they fled from is returning to complete something that should never have been started. The most terrifying mystery in Arkansas history is not that people disappeared without explanation in 1907. The most terrifying mystery is why we believe that seal, that barrier between what lives beneath the earth and what lives above it, could ever truly hold. Time is not on our side. The structure is opening, and it remembers what it is owed. This is an original fictional horror story, created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental. The thing that hunted me didn't need my blood or my body. It needed something more specific. It needed my voice. And once it had learned how to use it, it needed me to understand what that meant. My name is David Carver, and I'm a linguist specializing in phonetics and voice identification. I spent 8 years working for a company that developed voice recognition software, and I've spent the last 3 years consulting independently for various clients, mostly helping with authentication systems and vocal analysis. My expertise is in the acoustic properties of human speech, in the tiny variations that make each person's voice unique and theoretically impossible to perfectly replicate. I know more about the human voice than most people know about anything, which is precisely why I almost didn't recognize when mine stopped being mine alone. It started in late October in northern New Mexico, in a small town called Cascade Falls near the Arizona border. I'd moved there after leaving my job in Denver, drawn by the isolation and the strange beauty of the high desert. My house sat on 5 acres of sparse piñon and juniper forest, far enough from neighbors that I could work without interruption. I'd rented it furnished from a woman named Elena Mora, who lived 2 houses over and who seemed relieved that I wasn't asking too many questions about the previous tenants or why the house had sat empty for 3 years. The first incident was subtle enough that I almost dismissed it as coincidence. I was working in my office, analyzing voice samples for a client who suspected fraudulent insurance claims when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my brother's number. My brother James lives in Maine, and we don't talk often, maybe once every 2 months, so seeing his name appear on my phone at 3 in the afternoon was unusual. "James?" I answered. "Dave," the voice said. It was James's voice perfectly. The characteristic rasp in the lower register from a childhood bout of croup. The slight New England accent he's never quite lost. "How are you doing?" "Good. How'd you get my number?" It was an absurd question the moment I asked it. He's my brother. Of course he has my number. But something in the call felt wrong, in a way I couldn't articulate. "Listen, I need to ask you something," James said. "I've been having some issues with a credit card, and I wanted to make sure you hadn't had any identity theft problems." We talked for another minute. James explained details about fraudulent charges that seemed plausible, asked me about security practices, and then ended the call by saying he'd call me back later to discuss it further. 30 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time, it was actually James. He was calling from his actual number, and he was confused when I mentioned he'd called me earlier. "I haven't called you all week," he said. "Why would I call about credit card fraud?" My spine went cold. "Because someone just did. Someone who sounded exactly like you." James was silent for a moment. "Dave, that's not funny. I'm not trying to be funny." We spent the next 15 minutes verifying that, yes, someone had called me while spoofing James's number. And no, James had no idea how that was possible. He suggested it was some new spoofing technology, that it was probably identity thieves, that I should report it to the police and monitor my accounts. I did all those things. The police seemed uninterested. My accounts showed no fraudulent activity. Everything appeared to be fine. But something in my professional expertise told me that what I'd experienced was not standard spoofing technology. Spoofing can make a call appear to come from a specific number, but the voice itself is still the spoofed caller's voice. What I'd experienced was someone impersonating James's voice specifically, with perfect reproduction of his acoustic characteristics. That required either an impossibly talented mimic or voice synthesis technology, far more advanced than anything publicly available. I told myself it was probably military or government technology that had leaked. I told myself it wasn't something to worry about. I tried to return to my work. Then it happened again, 3 days later. This time it was my ex-girlfriend, Catherine. She called at 11 in the morning, and I almost didn't answer because we hadn't spoken in 6 months. But something made me pick up, and the voice that came through was unmistakably Catherine's. The slight breathlessness when she talked, the way she dropped her R's at the end of words, the particular cadence she used when she was nervous. "David, the first need to talk to you about something," she said. "I'm worried about you. I've been having these feelings like something bad is going to happen to you. I know we're not together anymore, but I still care, and I wanted to call and make sure you were okay." The concern in her voice seemed genuine. But when I called Catherine back 10 minutes later on her actual number, she told me she'd done no such thing. She was disturbed by the call. She asked if I was okay. She seemed frightened by the idea that someone was impersonating her. By the fourth call, I was no longer willing to dismiss it as coincidence or technology. The fourth call came from my mother, who lives in Portland and who has severe arthritis that makes phone calls difficult. She called to ask if I'd received a package she'd sent, and she talked about family gossip, about my father's health, about her concerns that I was living too remotely. When I called her back, she told me she hadn't called. She told me she was scared. She told me to call the police. I did call the police. I reported the incidents and showed them my phone records. The officers were sympathetic but unhelpful. They suggested blocking the numbers, suggested that I was likely being targeted by identity thieves, suggested that these things happened and there was limited recourse. But I knew something they didn't know. I knew that replicating a voice at this level of sophistication wasn't about identity theft or financial fraud. It required something more deliberate, something more personal. Someone or something was learning my social connections, learning how the people I cared about spoke, learning how to imitate them specifically enough that I would believe the imitations were genuine, learning, in other words, how to isolate me. That understanding should have made me leave. It would have been the rational response, but I was fascinated in a way that overrode fear, that made me want to understand what was happening. I was a scientist. I was a voice expert. This was the most interesting mystery I'd encountered in years. I began setting up recording equipment throughout my house. I installed additional security cameras. I started keeping obsessively detailed records of every call, every interaction, every strange occurrence. I told myself I was documenting evidence for law enforcement. I told myself I was maintaining scientific rigor. But what I was really doing was waiting for the next contact, anticipating the next call, almost looking forward to being called by someone whose voice I loved. The next call came from myself. I was alone in my office when the phone rang. The caller ID showed my own number, and when I answered, I heard my own voice coming through the phone, speaking with perfect reproduction of my own acoustic patterns. Every idiosyncratic feature of my speech replicated flawlessly. "Hello, David," my voice said. "I'm calling to tell you that I've learned your voice now. I've learned how you speak when you're alone. I've learned how you speak to people you care about. I've learned the micro variations and the stress patterns and the ways your voice changes with emotion and intention. I've learned you." I hung up immediately. My hands were shaking. For the first time since the calls began, I felt genuine terror rather than scientific curiosity. I didn't receive any more calls that night. But I heard my voice anyway. I heard it in the kitchen around midnight, calling my name. I heard it outside my bedroom window, around 2 in the morning, reciting random phrases from conversations I'd had years ago. I heard it in the walls, echoing through the ventilation system, speaking words I'd spoken to people I'd loved. By dawn, I was in my car driving toward Albuquerque. I checked into a hotel downtown and spent the next 3 days trying to understand what was happening. I researched voice replication technology obsessively. I looked into folklore about entities that could mimic human speech. I contacted colleagues in the voice science field and asked carefully worded questions about whether perfect vocal imitation by another party was theoretically possible. Most of my colleagues dismissed it as essentially impossible. A woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in phonetic analysis, responded differently. She called me rather than emailing, which was unusual. "David, when you asked about vocal imitation, you weren't asking hypothetically," she said. "It wasn't a question. No. Has something been mimicking your voice, or voices of people close to you?" I told her everything. I expected skepticism. Instead, I got something worse: recognition. "I've encountered reports of this before," Sarah said quietly. "Not many, and they're scattered geographically, but there's a pattern. It starts with someone hearing a perfect imitation of a loved one's voice. Then, the imitations become more frequent. Then the person being targeted experiences hearing their own voice. And then, in the cases where documentation exists, the person experiencing the phenomenon tends to disappear. Disappears how? Nobody knows. They just leave. They abandon their lives and vanish, usually within a few weeks of the phenomenon beginning. The assumption is that they're so disturbed that they're compelled to flee, to find somewhere safe. But I've always wondered if there's more to it than that. What causes it? I asked. What kind of technology could produce something like this? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. It's not technology, David. Or if it is, it's not ours. There are old stories, indigenous accounts from various parts of North America, about beings that could perfectly mimic human voices. The Navajo have specific folklore about entities that can replicate voices and use them to hunt. The accounts are consistent across different tribes and different time periods, and they all describe the same outcome. The person being hunted is called away by the thing that has learned their voice. They follow their own voice into the wilderness, or into places they shouldn't go, and they don't return. And it's learning to speak you perfectly. That's folklore. That's not real, is it? Sarah asked. David, you're a scientist. You know how to verify evidence. You know how to recognize patterns. Tell me honestly, does it sound like what you're experiencing is technological, or does it sound like something else? I couldn't answer her. Instead, I asked her where the reports were concentrated. The Southwest, she said. Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, primarily. Tribal lands and areas near tribal lands, but also spreading outward. The phenomenon seems to be becoming more common. The most recent reliable report I found was from 6 months ago in Colorado. A woman named Patricia Vance reported hearing perfect imitations of her voice and the voices of family members. She vanished from her home in Cortez 2 weeks after filing a report with local law enforcement. After I hung up with Sarah, I sat in my hotel room trying to process the information. I had moved to New Mexico deliberately. My house was in an area near Navajo territorial boundaries. I had positioned myself, entirely by accident, in exactly the place where this phenomenon was most prevalent. Either that, or it had drawn me there. The thought occurred to me that I'd been operating under a false assumption. I'd believed that something had found me randomly, that my house had been an arbitrary target. But what if that wasn't true? What if something had been aware of me before I moved to New Mexico? What if my decision to relocate had been influenced by something I couldn't perceive, guided by something that had already marked me? I rented a different hotel room under a false name. I used cash. I stopped using my credit cards. I tried to make myself invisible, and for 3 days nothing happened. No calls, no voices, no sense of being pursued. On the 4th day, I decided to drive back to my house to retrieve my documentation, my research, everything I'd gathered about the phenomenon. I told myself I was going to take it to Sarah, that we would investigate this together, that there would be scientific explanations that didn't involve folklore and impossible creatures. I was lying to myself. I arrived at my house at dusk. The landscape looked different than it had when I left, more empty somehow, more bare, as if the desert had grown thinner, as if the barrier between the physical world and something else had weakened. The front door was unlocked. I was certain I'd locked it when I left. I was certain of many things that suddenly became uncertain in the presence of that unlocked door. I entered carefully, turning on lights, announcing myself as if the house was occupied by something that might respect such formality. The interior was exactly as I'd left it. My equipment still set up in the office, my recording devices still mounted, my research still organized on my desk. But there was something new. On my computer monitor, the screen had been activated, the screensaver had been disabled, and playing on a loop, through the speakers, was a recording. My own voice, speaking a long monologue about my work, about my past, about the most intimate details of my life. Private things. Things I'd never recorded, never spoken aloud to anyone. Things I'd only thought. The voice wasn't quite perfect. There was a quality to it that was almost right, but not quite, as if something had tried to replicate my voice based on incomplete information and had nearly succeeded. The attempt itself was the most terrifying thing I'd experienced yet. It meant something was trying to learn me completely, to understand not just how I spoke, but what I thought, how I reasoned, what motivated me. The loop ended and restarted. My voice began the monologue again. I turned off the computer and backed out of the office. That's when I heard the sound outside, my voice, calling from the desert. It was calling my name. David, David, David. Over and over, the familiar cadence and pitch and character of my own speech, emanating from the darkness beyond my property. I got in my car without gathering anything. I drove away from that house, and I didn't stop driving until I reached the Colorado border. For 6 months after fleeing New Mexico, I tried to maintain a normal life. I moved to a small town in Wyoming, far from the Southwest, far from tribal lands, far from the areas where Sarah had indicated the phenomenon was concentrated. I changed my name legally to David Morrison. I took work through intermediaries, never speaking on the phone, only conducting business through email and video calls with camera disabled. And for a while, it seemed to work. No calls, no voices, no manifestations of my own speech patterns turned against me. But in May, I received an email from Sarah Chen. The subject line read, "It's spreading north. You need to know." I didn't open it immediately. I didn't want to know. But I opened it anyway, and Sarah told me about 3 new reports from Montana, 2 from Wyoming, 1 from South Dakota, all following the same pattern, all concentrated geographically around my current location. The thing hadn't lost me. It had followed me, or I was still being called, and I just couldn't hear it yet. That night, I heard my voice for the first time since New Mexico. It came through the radio in my car, speaking into a dead frequency, calling me by my new name, the name I'd thought nobody knew. I've spent the last 8 months running. I've moved to different towns, different states, always staying ahead of the reports Sarah sends me, always trying to find a place where my voice won't find me. But I understand now that running is pointless. The thing that knows my voice isn't hunting me geographically. It's hunting me acoustically. It's following the sound of my speech wherever I am, learning more about me with every call, every manifestation, every instance where it reproduces my voice. And I understand something else now, something that terrifies me more than any immediate danger. I'm beginning to recognize the things attempt at my voice. I'm beginning to see the patterns in how it's learning me. I'm beginning to understand that with each replication, each attempt to perfectly reproduce my speech, the thing is becoming more me. The most recent call came 3 days ago. A perfect imitation of my voice, so accurate that I can't find any flaw in it. So accurate that when I heard it, I had to check the phone to confirm it wasn't me calling myself. "Hello, David," the perfect voice said. "I've learned you now. I understand your inflection and your rhythm and every micro variation of your speech. I've learned you so completely that I'm not sure where you end and where I begin." "What do you want?" I asked. "I want to know if you understand what happens next," the voice said. "I want to know if you realize that I'm not just learning your voice. I'm learning your identity. I'm becoming you. And soon, the distinction between us will be too subtle for anyone to recognize." I hung up the phone. I'm writing this account now because I need someone to understand what's happening before it's too late. Before the thing that knows my voice has learned enough of me to complete whatever transformation it's pursuing. I need people to know that there are entities in the world that don't hunt with teeth or claws. There are things that hunt by mimicry, that consume identity through perfect replication, that hunt the self rather than the body. Sarah Chen has stopped responding to my emails. When I called her office, I was told she no longer worked there. Her department chair said she'd left abruptly 6 weeks ago without explanation. I don't know if she met one of these things. I don't know if her expertise made her a target, or if she simply knew too much and had to disappear. What I do know is that the next time I hear my voice, I might not be the one hearing it. What I do know is that something is wearing my speech patterns like a skin, trying them on, learning exactly how I sound when I'm afraid, when I'm desperate, when I'm calling for help. What I do know is that eventually, the imitation will be so perfect that no one will be able to tell the difference. And when that happens, the thing will have what it was hunting for all along: a human life, a human identity, a human voice that it can use to call to others, to hunt them the way it hunted me. The last message I received came today. It wasn't a call, it was an email, sent from my own email address, to my own email address. The message contained a single sentence, written in perfect English. in the exact style that I use when I write. Thank you for teaching me how to be you. I don't know who wrote that email. I don't know if it was sent by something else or by something that's already learned enough of me that the distinction no longer matters. What I know is that I can feel it in my throat. I can feel the pressure of it in my speech, the way it's learning the exact position of my tongue, the tension in my jaw, the breath control that creates the particular quality of my voice. I know that soon, maybe tomorrow, maybe today, I'll try to speak and won't recognize the voice that emerges from my mouth. I know that at that moment the hunt will be over. And I know that the thing that knows my voice will be ready to call to someone else. If you hear your own voice calling to you from somewhere it shouldn't be, if you receive calls from the people you love perfectly imitating their speech, if you begin to recognize that something is learning how you sound, learning how you speak, learning your voice with an accuracy that no human mimic could achieve, then you need to understand what's happening. You need to understand that your voice is not your own. You need to understand that something is consuming your identity, one perfect replication at a time. And you need to understand that by the time you recognize what's happening, you've probably already heard it speak as you. And that means the learning is almost complete. Run if you want, hide if you think it will help, but know that it will find you wherever you go, because it's not looking for your location. It's looking for the sound of your voice. This is an original, fictional horror story, created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental. I've spent the last 4 years working as a gravedigger and groundskeeper at Hollowbrook Cemetery in upstate New York, and I've learned that death is less mysterious when you work near it every day. Or at least, that's what I believed until I started finding graves that had been opened from the inside. My name is Thomas Whitmore, and I'm 42 years old. I spent 20 years in construction before my body started failing me. Back problems, joint damage, the cumulative wear of physical labor. Grave digging seemed like a logical transition. It paid decently. The work was steadier than contract construction. And I thought the solitude would be peaceful. I was wrong about the solitude part, but I was right that it paid the bills. I rented a small house on the cemetery's property, took care of the grounds, maintained the records, and dug graves when the deaths occurred frequently enough to justify the work. Hollowbrook is one of the older cemeteries in the region, established in 1887, containing roughly 4,000 graves spread across 32 acres of land that had been carefully maintained and deliberately left as natural as possible. The grounds include mature trees, walking paths, a small chapel, and an office where I manage the administrative work. It's a beautiful place, the kind of cemetery that seems designed to make death feel peaceful and permanent. I liked working there. I liked the quiet. I liked the sense of purpose that came from maintaining a space dedicated to the dead. The first grave I found that had been disturbed from below was in the older section of the cemetery, an area established in the 1890s that contained some of the original stones. I noticed it on a cold morning in late October while doing my routine groundskeeping work. The earth over the grave had shifted, created a shallow depression, as if something beneath had settled or collapsed. The headstone bore the name Eleanor Carmichael, dated 1871 to 1952. I reported it to my supervisor, a woman named Patricia Denham, who worked for the cemetery board and handled most of the administrative decisions. She suggested that the ground had probably settled over the decades, that it happened occasionally with older graves, and that I should simply fill in the depression and continue with my work. One did exactly that, never thinking that the settling ground might have been caused by something other than the natural process of decomposition and compaction. 3 weeks later, I found another one. This grave was in the middle section of the cemetery. dating from the 1960s. Again, the earth had shifted, creating a depression directly over the burial site. This time, I also noticed something else. Small stones displaced around the grave, loose earth scattered in a pattern that seemed deliberate rather than accidental. When I examined the displaced soil more closely, I could see what appeared to be scratch marks in the earth, as if something had clawed or scraped its way upward. I mentioned it to Patricia again, with more concern this time. She came to the cemetery to inspect it herself, and I watched her expression change as she examined the grave. She didn't immediately dismiss it as natural settling. "How many graves have shown this pattern?" she asked. "Two that I've noticed, but I only started paying close attention after the first one." "Check the older sections," Patricia said. "Look at the elevation changes. Map them. I want to know if this is something systematic or just random deterioration." Over the next week, I systematically examined every grave in the cemetery, paying particular attention to areas where the ground surface had changed. What I found was disturbing. There were at least 30 graves showing signs of subsidence, of the earth settling unevenly in patterns that suggested something had moved beneath the surface. Most were old, but not all. Some dated from the 1980s, a few from the 1990s. I created a map showing each location, and I brought it to Patricia. She studied it for a long time without speaking. "I need to tell you something," she said finally. "And I need you to understand that I'm telling you this because you need to know. But I also need you to promise that you won't share this information with other staff. Or, more importantly, with the families who have relatives here." "Okay," I said, though her tone was making me deeply uneasy. 7 years ago, we had a situation at Hollowbrook. A grave was exhumed for a legal reason, a DNA verification for an estate dispute. When we opened the grave, we found that it had been disturbed. The coffin had been damaged from the inside. There were scratch marks on the underside of the lid. The remains showed signs of disturbance that were inconsistent with normal decomposition. I said nothing. I was processing what she was telling me, trying to make sense of it. "We reported it," Patricia continued. "We contacted the police. They investigated and concluded that the grave had probably been disturbed by animals seeking food, that the damage to the coffin was consistent with predation and burrowing. They didn't pursue it further. We sealed the grave and never opened another one without explicit legal reason." "But you think something else caused it?" I asked. "I think there are things that happen in cemeteries that defy easy explanation. And I think the pattern you found suggests that whatever happened in that grave 7 years ago might not have been an isolated incident." That night, in my small house on the cemetery property, I began researching the history of Hollowbrook. I found newspaper archives, cemetery records, historical documentation. I was looking for any mention of incidents, disturbances, anything that might explain what Patricia had told me. What I found was scattered but consistent. In 1923, there was a brief newspaper article about grave desecration at Hollowbrook, though it provided no details about what had been desecrated or how. In 1951, another article mentioned unusual findings in an exhumed grave, but again was vague about specifics. In 1987, there was an incident report filed with local police regarding unauthorized disturb of burial sites, but the investigation was apparently closed with minimal findings. Each incident was decades apart. Each had been handled with minimal publicity. Each suggested that something was happening at Hollowbrook, that the cemetery management preferred to keep quiet. I started spending my nights in the cemetery itself, watching, waiting, trying to understand what was really happening beneath the carefully maintained lawns and manicured gardens. I told Patricia about my nighttime observations, and she didn't object. In fact, she seemed almost relieved that someone was taking the matter seriously. The first night I actually witnessed something unusual was in mid-November, nearly a month after finding the first disturbed grave. I was standing near the 1960s section, watching the area where I'd found the second shifted grave, when I noticed the ground itself moving. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to someone not specifically watching for it, but the soil was settling, collapsing inward slightly, as if whatever was beneath was shifting its weight, adjusting its position. I walked closer to investigate, shining my flashlight at the grave. The name on the headstone was David Morrison, who had died in 1967. The earth was definitely moving. I could see small stones rolling incrementally inward toward the center of the grave. Could see soil cascading slowly into whatever space had opened beneath. And then I heard it, a sound from beneath the earth. It was muffled by the soil and the coffin and whatever else lay between me and the remains below. But it was unmistakable. A sound like scratching, like clawing, like something beneath was trying to dig its way upward. I ran to the cemetery office and called Patricia. She arrived within an hour, and we both stood over the grave, listening to the sounds continue. The scratching would start, continue for a minute or two, then stop. It would resume after a brief silence. The pattern repeated for the entire time we watched. "We need to exhume it," I said. "We need to open that grave and see what's inside." "We can't," Patricia replied. "We don't have legal authority. We can't disturb a grave without a court order. Then something is actively dying down there. We can't just leave it. We don't know what it is," Patricia said. "And disturbing it might be worse than leaving it alone." But we did disturb it, eventually. Patricia obtained a court order by claiming structural concerns about the grave's stability, by suggesting that the integrity of the burial site was compromised and needed investigation for liability purposes. The order was granted, and 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in a cemetery at dawn, watching as a backhoe carefully removed the earth from over the grave. When we reached the coffin, I understood why Patricia had been hesitant to open it. The casket had been damaged extensively from the inside. The lid bore deep scratch marks, gouges in the wood, as if something with significant strength had clawed at it repeatedly. The sides showed similar damage, and when we carefully opened the lid, we found remains that were impossible to explain through any standard decomposition process. The skeleton was disturbed, the bones scattered and rearranged as if the body had moved, had struggled, had tried to break free from its burial. And there were marks on the bones themselves, scratches and gouges that suggested something with sharp implements had been working at the corpse. Most disturbing of all was the positioning. The arm bones were raised, the leg bones were flexed as if in motion. The skull was tilted upward as if the deceased had been trying to look toward the surface, toward escape. The coroner who examined the remains was baffled. The body had been dead for nearly 60 years, and yet the disturbance to the remains was recent, the scratches and damage showing no significant age. He suggested that grave robbers or vandals must have opened the coffin, disturbed the remains, and then sealed it again without anyone noticing. But there were no signs of the coffin being opened from outside. The lid hadn't been removed and replaced. It had been clawed from within. I spent the next several weeks examining every disturbed grave that I'd identified on my map. I obtained court orders for 6 additional exhumations, claiming structural concerns or water damage or other issues that justified opening the graves. Each one told the same story, remains that showed signs of movement, of struggle, of something within the coffin trying to escape. Each one showed damage that was internally consistent, that could only have been caused by something within the burial site attempting to break free. The coroner's office became suspicious after the 3rd exhumation. They contacted the police, and I was questioned about why I was requesting so many grave openings. I explained about the pattern, about the disturbed earth, about the evidence that something was happening in the cemetery that defied standard explanation. The police seemed unconvinced. They suggested that if I was concerned about grave desecration, I should report it through proper channels. They seemed to consider the matter closed, but I couldn't let it go. I became obsessed with understanding what was happening in the cemetery. I spent my days researching cemetery history, reading about grave ecology, studying the processes of decomposition and burial. I spent my nights watching the cemetery, waiting to see if I could observe the phenomenon directly. It was on a night in early December when I finally witnessed something undeniable. I was sitting on a bench near the section containing the most disturbed graves, a thermos of coffee in my hands, watching the moonlit landscape. It was past midnight, the cemetery silent except for the wind in the trees. And then I saw movement at one of the graves, at the site of Eleanor Carmichael's burial, the first disturbed grave I'd discovered. The earth itself was moving, not settling, not collapsing, rising. The soil was being pushed upward from below, a deliberate excavation happening from beneath the surface. I watched, transfixed, as the earth shifted and shifted, creating an ever larger depression that was simultaneously filling itself as soil cascaded inward. Then the ground split open. It was a small opening at first, just a crack in the earth, but it widened rapidly. Something was pushing its way upward, something large enough that it had to displace significant soil to create space for itself. I could see dirt falling into the opening, could see the shape of something emerging, could see what appeared to be fingers or appendages pushing through the earth. I stood up, my instinct to run, but I was frozen by a need to understand what I was witnessing. The shape pushing through the earth was becoming clearer now, and my mind refused to process what it was showing me. It was a hand, a human hand, desiccated and skeletal, its fingers articulated and functional, its movements deliberate and purposeful. It grasped the edge of the opening, pulled itself upward, and a forearm followed, then a shoulder, then something that might have been a head, though it was distorted, elongated, changed from what a human head should be. I finally found the ability to move. I ran. I ran toward the cemetery office, my rational mind screaming that what I'd seen was impossible, that I must have been hallucinating, that no reanimated corpse could crawl from its grave and move with purposeful intent. When I reached the office, I called Patricia. She answered immediately, as if she'd been expecting my call. "You saw something," she said. "It wasn't a question. There's something coming out of the graves, something that was buried, something that's been trying to escape for years. And tonight, it succeeded." There was a long silence on the line. "Stay in the office," Patricia said finally. "Lock the doors. Don't go outside. I'm coming there now." She arrived 20 minutes later with a man I'd never met before, someone she introduced only as Dr. Brennan. He was elderly, maybe in his 70s, with gray hair and eyes that held a knowledge of something terrible. He didn't introduce himself with any credential or official position. He simply seemed to expect to be in a cemetery at 2 in the morning discussing the reanimation of corpses. "Show me," he said to me. I led them back to Eleanor Carmichael's grave. The opening was still there, the earth still disturbed, but whatever had emerged had retreated or moved away. The grave was empty in the sense that no body was visible, but it was clearly violated, clearly the site of something significant. Dr. Brennan examined the opening without emotion. He knelt down and looked into the darkness beneath, and I saw his expression harden into something between understanding and resignation. "How many graves?" he asked. "At least 30 showing signs of disturbance," I said. "But I think there might be more." "How long have you worked here?" "4 years. And the disturbances have been happening longer than that, as far back as I can determine. The pattern seems to go back decades." Dr. Brennan stood and turned to Patricia. "We need to do a full survey. We need to identify every grave showing this pattern and compile a complete history of the cemetery's incidents. And we need to do it quickly, because whatever is happening is accelerating." Over the next month, Dr. Brennan essentially took over the cemetery investigation. He brought in specialists, people who worked on cemetery ecology and soil analysis, and who asked very specific questions about the cemetery's history and geographical location. He studied our records, examined the exhumed remains, and conducted tests on the soil and the coffins themselves. What he discovered was both the explanation and the horror. Hollowbrook Cemetery sat on the site of a much older burial ground. Not an official cemetery, but a place where bodies had been interred by indigenous peoples, possibly centuries before European settlement. When the current cemetery was established in 1887, the developers had been unaware of or indifferent to the older graves beneath and around their new construction. But the indigenous remains hadn't simply stayed buried and forgotten. According to Dr. Brennan, there was something in the soil composition, something related to the minerals in the earth and the specific combination of geological features at that location that prevented normal decomposition. The bodies were being preserved, maintained in a state of suspended animation, their biological processes slowed to a rate so minimal that decay was almost unnoticeable. And something in that preservation, combined with the indigenous burial practices and the specific environment, was keeping the remains alive, not alive in a conventional sense, but not entirely dead either. The bodies were conscious, in a way, or at least, they retained some form of awareness, some drive to escape the coffins and the earth that contained them. The indigenous peoples buried their dead to return to the earth, Dr. Brennan explained to Patricia and me. It was a spiritual process, a return to the source. But the soil here created a trap instead. The bodies don't decay, they don't rest. They're held in a state between life and death, and they remain aware enough to struggle, to try to escape, to claw their way free. How is that possible? I asked. The bodies are skeletal. They're decades or centuries old. How can they be aware? How can they move? Because the preservation prevents the decay of the nervous system, Dr. Brennan said. The minds don't deteriorate. The awareness persists. And eventually, either through sheer time or through some psychological compulsion created by this state of living burial, the bodies attempt escape. They scratch and claw and dig, driven by an instinct to return to the earth, not realizing they're already in it. And when the European graves were built on top, the same thing happened to them? I asked. Yes, but more slowly, because the European burial practices didn't prepare the remains for this type of preservation. It took decades, sometimes a century or more, for the consciousness to fully awaken, for the drive to escape to become strong enough to manifest. But eventually, yes, the same process begins. The implications were staggering. Every grave in Hollowbrook, eventually, would produce the same result. Every body buried there would eventually regain consciousness, would eventually struggle against the coffin and the soil, would eventually try to claw its way to the surface. Some might take 50 years, some might take 100. But the process was inevitable. What do we do? Patricia asked. Do we exhume every grave and rebury them elsewhere? Do we drain the cemetery? Do we destroy it? There is no solution, Dr. Brennan said quietly. The condition is permanent. The soil is what it is. Every body buried here is trapped in this state. The best you can do is manage it. Try to contain the damage and limit future burials. But that was the problem. Hollowbrook was still active. People died. Families wanted to bury their deceased at this cemetery that had held their family members for generations. We couldn't simply stop accepting burials. The legal and social implications would be catastrophic, and we had no explanation we could publicly provide. Instead, Patricia and I made a decision. We would stop maintaining the cemetery as a place of beauty. We would allow certain areas to become overgrown, to become inaccessible. We would subtly discourage burials in the older sections. We would work to gradually, quietly, minimize the cemetery's usage without announcing why. In the meanwhile, I would maintain constant surveillance of the disturbed graves, watching for emergence events, documenting the process so that if someone eventually discovered what was happening, we would at least have evidence of how long we'd tried to contain it. The first emergence happened on a frozen February night, at a grave in the 1980 section. The body came partially free, enough that its skeletal arm and shoulder were exposed above the earth. I documented it with photographs, carefully pushed the remains back beneath the surface, and filled in the grave again. I didn't call the police. I didn't report it to anyone except Patricia. More emergences followed, one every 2 to 3 weeks at first, then with increasing frequency as winter turned to spring. Each time, I would find the evidence of the emergence, carefully seal it, and record the location and date in a log that nobody else was meant to see. By summer, I realized that I couldn't contain it alone. The emergences were becoming more frequent, more violent. One grave showed damage to the headstone, as if the emerging remains had struck it with significant force. Another showed evidence that the body had moved laterally through the earth, trying to find a way out in a different direction. I brought my concerns to Patricia, and she made arrangements for Dr. Brennan to visit again. He arrived on a warm August afternoon, and we conducted a survey of the recent emergences. His expression became increasingly grim as he examined the evidence. "It's accelerating," he said. "The process is speeding up. What was taking years now seems to be taking months. And the consciousness is becoming more sophisticated, more capable of deliberate action." "What does that mean?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "It means the oldest remains, the indigenous bodies buried here for centuries, are becoming fully conscious. And consciousness combined with a century of attempting escape creates something that might be capable of actually succeeding." That night, I watched as the earth over one of the oldest graves, a plot from the cemetery's early years, split open completely. The skeletal figure that emerged was different from the others. It moved with purpose and coordination. It pulled itself free of the earth with deliberate effort, sat upright on the edge of its own grave, and turned its head as if looking around, orienting itself, understanding its situation. I was terrified. I was also fascinated. I watched from a distance as the figure stood, its movements jerky and uncertain at first, but becoming more fluid as it adjusted to using its limbs. It took a step, then another. It began walking, slowly, between the graves, seeming to navigate the terrain with purposeful intent, despite having been dead for potentially 100 years or more. I followed it at a distance, documented its movement with photographs, watched as it made its way to the edge of the cemetery property, and then beyond, into the forest that surrounded Hollowbrook. I reported what I'd seen to Patricia, and she contacted Dr. Brennan immediately. He arrived within hours, and we spent the rest of the night discussing what needed to happen next. "It will return," Dr. Brennan said, "or others will emerge. Once the consciousness has fully awakened, once the body has experienced escape, it won't be satisfied with remaining buried. There will be more emergences, and they will become increasingly capable. Then we seal the cemetery," Patricia said. "We close it. We don't allow any more burials. And if the remains escape into the surrounding community," Dr. Brennan asked, "what's your explanation then?" Patricia had no answer to that. The situation escalated dramatically in September. I found 7 graves that had been opened from below within a single week. The remains from 4 of those graves had escaped, leaving only evidence of their emergence. The other 3 still contained skeletal remains, but these were positioned differently, arranged with what appeared to be deliberate intent. And I found something else. In the soil of one of the opened graves, I discovered a message scratched into the earth itself in a pattern that could almost be read. "Let us out." The letters were crude, traced by skeletal fingers in dirt, but unmistakably intentional. The consciousness had developed language, or had somehow retained memory of language, and was communicating. That was when I decided I had to leave. I contacted Patricia and told her I was resigning, effective immediately. I couldn't continue living on the cemetery property, couldn't continue maintaining the grounds, couldn't continue documenting the emergence of reanimated corpses. I packed my belongings, left the keys with Patricia, and drove away from Hollowbrook. But I couldn't leave the matter unresolved. Dr. Brennan contacted me a week after I'd left, asking me to meet with him. We met at a coffee shop in a nearby town, and he presented me with a proposal. He was documenting the phenomenon, compiling evidence, creating a record. He wanted me to help him, to provide my logs and photographs, to help him understand the complete history of what had happened at Hollowbrook. Together, we spent the following months compiling the data, creating a comprehensive history of the cemetery's disturbances, going back to the earliest documented incidents. We contacted other researchers, other experts in cemetery ecology and anomalous preservation, and gradually built an understanding of what Hollowbrook was and what it contained. What we discovered was that this wasn't unique. There were other cemeteries, other burial grounds in various locations that showed similar patterns. The phenomenon seemed to be concentrated in areas that had indigenous burial sites beneath modern cemeteries, locations where the soil composition created conditions of remarkable preservation, where the consciousness of the dead somehow persisted beyond death. We documented at least 4 other sites in the United States showing similar patterns. 2 in the Southwest, 1 in the Upper Midwest, 1 in the Southeast. All were located on or near historic indigenous burial grounds. All were experiencing gradual emergence events that cemetery management was quietly covering up. But Hollowbrook was becoming critical. The emergence events were no longer rare or contained. By the time I'd been gone for 6 months, Patricia reported to me that there had been at least 30 individual emergences, and only half of those bodies had been recovered. The remaining half had disappeared into the surrounding forest and neighboring communities. A series of strange incidents began being reported in the area around the cemetery. People saw skeletal figures walking through forests at night. There were reports of disturbances in graveyards in neighboring towns. There was an elderly woman who reported seeing her deceased grandfather walking along a road, moving with jerky, unnatural movements, his form deteriorating as she watched. The police started investigating, but they found no bodies, no evidence of foul play, nothing that could be officially documented and prosecuted. The incidents were dismissed as misidentifications, as people seeing shadows and imagining the worst. I met with Patricia one final time in the cemetery office to review the current situation. She looked exhausted, aged by stress and fear. "We're losing control," she said simply. "The emergences happen multiple times per week now. Most of the recent bodies are escaping completely. We don't know where they're going or what they're doing. What does Dr. Brennan recommend?" "He recommends we excavate the entire cemetery, exhume every body, remove them from this location, and disperse them to other burial grounds. But that's financially impossible. It would cost millions. The cemetery board would never approve it. And if we tried to do it quietly, it would expose what's been happening here for decades." "So what are you going to do?" "Nothing," Patricia said. "We're going to let it happen. We're going to allow the cemetery to do what it does. And we're going to hope that when the bodies emerge, they simply disperse into the world and fade away. Maybe consciousness can't persist outside of the cemetery. Maybe the soil is what maintains the awareness, and once separated from it, the bodies will finally rest." "And if that's not what happens," Patricia didn't answer. "I'm writing this account now, 6 months after leaving Hollowbrook, because the situation has deteriorated beyond containment. The cemetery is essentially abandoned. Families have stopped burying there. Patricia has resigned from her position. The cemetery board is in chaos, unable to make decisions about what to do with a facility that is producing humanoid remains that seem to be slowly migrating into the surrounding communities. And I've started seeing them. Last week, I saw a skeletal figure walking along a road near my apartment. It was walking with the jerky, uncertain movements I recognized from the emergence events. Its clothing was remnants of fabric from decades past. Its face was a skull, but there was something in the empty eye sockets that suggested awareness, that suggested it was looking at me, that suggested it was cognizant of my presence. I drove away immediately. The night after that, I heard scratching sounds in the walls of my apartment. I've called the landlord, claiming it's rats or mice, but I know what it is. Something that emerged from Hollowbrook has found me. Something that remembers, perhaps, that I was the one who documented its emergence, who recorded its attempted escape, who studied its struggle to be free. And I think it's here to tell me something. The scratching continues every night now, moving through the walls, circling my bed, positioning itself as if trying to break through. I haven't slept in days. I've started hearing sounds that might be speech, words that might be forming from the scratching and the movement. Dr. Brennan told me, in our last correspondence, that the consciousness of these emergent remains is tied to the cemetery's soil. But he also said that consciousness can persist and adapt, can transfer and migrate. He said that once a consciousness has tasted freedom, has experienced life outside of the grave, it becomes aware of possibility. And awareness of possibility creates desire. So I know what's coming. I know what will eventually claw its way into my bedroom. I know what will happen when it succeeds. But I also know something else now. I know that the consciousness wants to communicate. It wants to be understood. It wants someone to know what happened in the cemetery, what's happening in the cemeteries across the country where the soil traps consciousness and prevents it from resting. So I'm leaving this record. I'm publishing this account. I'm making public what Hollowbrook Cemetery is, what it contains, what has been quietly emerging from it for decades. If you visit a cemetery and you see the earth shifting, if you notice graves that seem disturbed from below, if you hear scratching sounds in the night coming from beneath the ground, you now know what you're witnessing. You're witnessing consciousness attempting escape from a burial that will never release it. You're witnessing the dead trying to return to the world because the earth won't let them return to peace. And you're witnessing the beginning of something that no cemetery management board, no official institution, no government agency has the ability or the will to stop. The emergences are spreading. The consciousness is spreading. And eventually, the number of reanimated remains walking in our world will become too large to hide, too obvious to deny, too real to ignore. That day is coming. It might come tomorrow. It might come in 5 years. But it's coming. And when it does, remember that the first people to know, the people who tried to document it and warn others, were dismissed as paranoid, as conspirators, as men and women who had fallen too deeply into obsession. Remember that the cemetery tried to contain something that couldn't be contained. And remember that the earth itself has decided it's done holding the dead. It's decided that the conscious, aware, struggling remnants of human mortality deserve a chance to walk again, to move in the light, to exist in a world beyond the graves that trap them. I can hear the scratching louder now. It's in the walls behind my bed. It's almost through. When it breaks through, I think I'll finally understand what the consciousness wants. I think it will finally communicate what it's been trying to say all along. And I think I'm going to listen, because I'm beginning to realize that the consciousness isn't trying to harm me. It's trying to teach me something. It's trying to show me what happens when the dead refuse to stay dead, when consciousness persists beyond the grave, when the living world and the world of burial become indistinguishable. The scratching stops. The wall is silent. And in that silence, I hear something else. I hear the sound of earth shifting, of soil being disturbed, of something moving through the spaces between this world and whatever lies beneath. It's here. It's finally here. And I think, as I feel the presence in my room, as I sense the awareness turning toward me, that maybe this is what resurrection really is. Not a return to life, but a refusal to accept death as permanent. Maybe the dead have simply learned that they don't have to obey the rules we've written for them. Maybe Hollowbrook wasn't a cemetery at all. Maybe it was the opposite. Maybe it was a place where the earth was teaching the dead how to live again. And now, standing in the darkness of my bedroom, I'm beginning to understand that lesson. I'm beginning to understand that the scratching isn't a threat. It's an invitation. This is an original fictional horror story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental. I've hiked the Appalachian Trail for portions of 5 different summers, and I've always believed that the trail respects those who respect it. I believed that if you followed the blazes, paid attention to the topography, and moved with intention, the mountains would let you pass through safely. I still believe that, but I also know now that there are sections of that trail that don't operate under those rules. There are places where the mountains aren't mountains anymore, where the forest doesn't follow natural laws, and where something has decided that some hikers don't get to leave. My name is Marcus Chen, and in late August of this year, my girlfriend Rachel and I decided to tackle a particularly remote section of the Appalachian Trail that cuts through the Blue Ridge Mountains in southwestern Virginia. We're both experienced backpackers. We've completed multi-week treks before. We understand navigation, weather preparation, and how to move safely through wilderness. We were not reckless or unprepared. What we were was unlucky enough to choose a time and place where something didn't want us to be. Rachel and I met in college, studying environmental science, and we've spent most of our vacations exploring America's wild places together. She works as a conservation biologist. I work as a park ranger for a national forest in Colorado. Hiking was more than recreation for us, it was our life. So when Rachel suggested we tackle the section of trail from McAfee Knob down through the high country of the Jefferson National Forest, I agreed immediately. It's considered one of the most beautiful sections of the entire trail, with multiple peaks above 4,000 feet, reliable water sources, and relatively light traffic for such a scenic area. We started early on a Saturday morning in late August, parking Rachel's car at the McAfee Knob trailhead and planning a 4-day loop that would take us through some of the most remote terrain in Virginia. The weather was perfect. Cool nights, warm days, clear skies. We had plenty of food, reliable maps, a GPS unit, and a satellite communicator as backup. We were as prepared as two experienced hikers could be. The first 2 days were exactly what we expected. We hiked through beautiful forests, camped at established sites, and saw only one other group of hikers, a pair of day hikers we passed on the afternoon of our first day. The terrain was challenging but manageable. The views from Tinker Mountain and McAfee Knob were breathtaking. We felt fortunate to have chosen this trail, fortunate to have the money and time to do this, fortunate to be alive in a world with places this beautiful. On the evening of our second day, we camped near Catawba Mountain, at a site that wasn't marked on our maps, but that was clearly used regularly by backpackers. The clearing was obvious, the fire ring was established, and the ground was flat and protected. We set up camp, cooked dinner, and went to sleep early, planning to cover a good distance the next day. That's when the sounds started. Rachel woke me around 2 in the morning, her hand on my shoulder, her voice urgent but quiet. "Do you hear that?" I did. From the forest surrounding our camp, there was the sound of movement, not the typical sounds of a large animal crashing through brush, but something more deliberate. Footsteps, almost, multiple footsteps, moving slowly through the forest, circling our camp. "Bear?" Rachel whispered. "Probably not," I said, though I wasn't certain. Too deliberate. "Could be deer." We listened for another few minutes. The sounds continued, circling, never approaching close enough to be immediately threatening, but present enough that we both remained alert. Whatever had been moving through the forest moved away or settled down to sleep. We didn't sleep again that night. We sat in our tent, listening to the forest and talking quietly about what we might have heard. Rachel suggested it was probably just wildlife spooked by our presence, doing what wild animals do at night. I agreed, but neither of us felt entirely convinced. In the morning, we found tracks around our camp. They were vague, pressed lightly into the soft earth, but they were definitely humanoid. Not animal tracks, not footprints from normal hiking boots. Something that walked on 2 legs, something large, something that had circled our camp repeatedly during the night. "Probably hikers," Rachel said, but there was uncertainty in her voice. Maybe they were curious about us. Maybe. We packed up camp and hit the trail by 7 in the morning, eager to put distance between ourselves and the strange visitors. The trail climbed steeply that day, taking us up McAfee Knob and then along a ridge that promised to give us some of the most spectacular views on the entire trail. By mid-morning, we were above the clouds, looking down at a sea of white that filled all the valleys around us. The views were extraordinary. We stopped frequently to photograph the landscape, to just sit and absorb the beauty of the mountains. By afternoon, we'd covered what our maps suggested was a solid 11 miles, and we were ready to camp at a designated shelter site near Catawba Lake. The shelter was a 3-sided Adirondack structure, the kind common throughout the AT, with room for about 6 people and a clear view of the lake below. We were not alone. There was a journal in the shelter, as there usually are. Hikers sign these journals and leave notes for others about trail conditions, wildlife sightings, and personal reflections. I opened it and started reading the recent entries, expecting to see the usual comments, but what I found was increasingly strange. The trail seemed shorter than it should be. I walked for what felt like 6 hours, but my GPS says I only covered 4 miles. That entry was from 3 weeks ago. Heard voices calling from the forest at night. Not hikers, something else. The voices knew my name. 2 weeks ago. I'm lost. I've been hiking for 2 days and I haven't seen another shelter or a water source. My maps show I should have reached Spring House Summit, but the terrain doesn't match. The forest looks wrong. 1 week ago. Don't hike alone here. Something hunts the solo hikers. I've seen it watching. I'm leaving the trail. If anyone reads this, don't continue past Catawba Lake. Turn back. 3 days ago. I showed the journal to Rachel. Her face went pale as she read. That's probably just someone being dramatic, she said. But she didn't sound convinced. Someone got lost, got scared, wrote it down in a journal for attention. Maybe, I said. But I was already looking at my GPS, checking our location, verifying our position against the map. According to the GPS, we were exactly where we should be. According to my calculations, we had hiked exactly the distance we'd planned to hike. The journal entries seemed paranoid, unreliable, but doubt had been introduced, and doubt is harder to remove from the mind than any physical threat. We set up camp in the shelter anyway. It was getting late, the weather was clear, and we were tired. We told ourselves we would leave first thing in the morning if we continued to feel uneasy. But we were experienced hikers. We weren't going to let someone else's hysteria dictate our plans. That night, the footsteps came again. They started around midnight, and they were closer this time. Circling the shelter, moving deliberately around our position, the footsteps of something large and bipedal. But there was something else too. There was sound from the forest that was harder to define. A kind of rustling, a susurration of movement, as if the entire forest was shifting, rearranging itself around our shelter. And there was singing. It was faint, difficult to hear, but unmistakable once I became aware of it. A sound like wind through trees, like water over rocks, like the forest itself, learning to vocalize. It wasn't human singing, but it had a structure to it, a pattern that suggested intentional composition. It rose and fell, repeated themes, modulated through different tones. "Do you hear it?" Rachel asked. She was gripping my arm tightly. "Yes. What is it?" "I don't know." We sat in the shelter, listening to the singing and the footsteps for hours. At some point, I realized that the footsteps had stopped circling us at a distance. They were much closer now. Whatever was making them was moving through the shelter itself, stepping over our packs, moving around our sleeping bags, its presence almost tangible. But in the morning, there were no tracks in the shelter, no evidence that anything had been inside with us. The journal we'd read had disappeared, replaced by a new journal that contained only blank pages. We left immediately after discovering the journal was gone. Neither of us voiced what we were both thinking, that something had come into the shelter with us during the night, and that the journal's warnings had been real. The trail should have taken us north, descending slightly into a valley, before climbing to the next ridge system. Our maps and our GPS both indicated the same route, but when we started hiking, something was wrong with the terrain. The path seemed to curve differently than it should. We would walk what felt like north, and end up heading northeast or northwest. We would try to correct for it by checking our compass, by using landmarks, by following the white blazes that marked the official AT route. But the forest seemed to resist our navigation. Rachel noticed it first. "We've passed that boulder before," she said, pointing to a distinctive rock formation jutting from the forest floor. "That's the same boulder we saw maybe an hour ago. But we've been walking in different directions. That doesn't make sense." I checked my GPS. The location showed we'd moved north and covered about 4 miles. But our visual landmarks suggested we were still in the same general area, that we might have been walking in circles or in patterns that didn't match what our instruments were telling us. "GPS is probably malfunctioning," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Let me try to recalibrate it." I went through the process of allowing the GPS to reacquire its position, checking for atmospheric interference, verifying the route. Everything checked out normally. According to the GPS, we were exactly where we were supposed to be. We were hiking in the right direction, and we were making good time. But the landscape disagreed. The landmarks weren't changing in the ways they should. The terrain wasn't descending the way the contour lines on our map suggested it should. The trail itself seemed to have become unreliable, guiding us through forests that looked almost identical regardless of where we were supposedly positioned. By mid-afternoon, we were both scared. Neither of us wanted to be the one to voice the obvious possibility that we were lost, that our instruments couldn't be trusted, that our maps were somehow inaccurate, that the forest was disorienting us in ways that went beyond normal navigation difficulties. "I think we should make camp," Rachel said quietly. "It's getting late, and we're clearly not in the place we think we are. Camping in daylight is better than hiking in darkness when we don't know where we're going." I agreed, and we found a clearing off the trail where we set up camp. We didn't use our designated camping location, didn't try to reach the next planned site. We just found a spot that seemed relatively safe and made it our camp for the night. As darkness fell, I tried to reassess our situation, using every resource we had. I ran the GPS multiple times. I compared our maps to the terrain. I used my phone compass, my dedicated hiking compass, and visual landmarks to try to determine our actual location. Nothing aligned. Our instruments said one thing, our eyes and ears said another. The singing started again around 11 o'clock. It was clearer this time, less like wind and more like actual voices, though voices that didn't quite fit the human vocal range. There were harmonies to it, complexity, as if multiple creatures were vocalizing together in a coordinated pattern. "We need to leave," Rachel said. "Tomorrow, at first light, we need to get off this trail and find our way back to the car." "How?" I asked. "We don't know which direction is which. Our instruments aren't reliable. The forest seems to be redirecting us somehow." "Then we'll hike downhill," Rachel said with desperate logic. "Downhill always leads to water. Water leads to streams. Streams lead to rivers. Rivers lead to civilization. We can navigate by gravity if we can't navigate by compass." It was sound logic. It was also our only real option, besides sitting in the forest and waiting for something to happen. But the forest wasn't going to let us leave by simple navigation. The next morning, we packed all our gear, took only what we could carry, and abandoned the trail entirely. We began hiking downslope, using the slope of the land as our guide. The terrain was steep, difficult, covered in rhododendron thickets and loose stone. We made slow progress, probably no more than a mile an hour, but we were moving downward, and that felt like progress. Then the terrain stopped descending. We hiked for what felt like 4 hours, constantly going down slope, constantly trying to move toward lower elevation. But when I checked the GPS, I realized we were at approximately the same elevation where we'd started that morning. The terrain had been deceiving us. Each slope we descended was offset by an ascent we hadn't noticed. The mountains were refusing to let us go down. "This is not possible," Rachel said flatly. "Terrain doesn't work this way. Gravity doesn't work this way." "I know. Then what's happening?" I didn't have an answer. What was happening seemed to violate the basic principles of geography and physics. But it was happening nonetheless. We sat on a rocky outcropping and tried to process the situation. The forest around us was dense, the trees ancient and massive, the undergrowth nearly impenetrable in places. We could hear running water in the distance, the sound of a stream, but whenever we tried to move toward the sound, the forest seemed to shift, the stream moving away, remaining always just out of reach. The singing resumed despite it being midday. It echoed through the trees with a quality that suggested it was coming from everywhere simultaneously, from the earth and the air and the trees themselves. That's when Rachel pointed to something I'd missed. On a rock face to our east, there was something carved into the stone. Symbols, old symbols, weathered by time but intentionally placed. They looked vaguely like circular marks, interconnected patterns that resembled a kind of map or diagram. There were more carvings as we looked, scattered throughout the area, on tree trunks, on stone outcroppings, in natural alcoves. Someone or something had marked this territory extensively, had left evidence of its presence in dozens of locations. Native American? Rachel asked hopefully. Historic site? Maybe, I said. But those carvings are old, very old, and they're placed with a pattern. They're marking something. They're creating a boundary. We were inside something. Some kind of territory, some kind of defined space that something had claimed and marked, and something had decided we didn't belong here. The realization crystallized into action. We needed to find the boundary. If the marks indicated territory, then tracing those marks might show us where the edge was, where the forest released its control and normal geography reasserted itself. We spent the rest of that day following the marked rocks and trees, trying to trace a perimeter. It was slow work. Many of the markings were subtle, easy to miss, clearly placed to be noticed by someone looking for them, but ignorable if you didn't know to look. We found patterns in the placement, circles within circles, marked points that seemed to connect, to form a massive geometric shape. By the time darkness fell, we had traced what appeared to be the outline of a territory roughly 3 miles in diameter. We were somewhere inside it. To escape, we needed to reach the perimeter and cross it. But that night, something prevented our escape attempt. The creatures came while we were still hiking, trying to reach what we calculated to be the western edge of the territory. They emerged from the forest so gradually that I didn't initially recognize them as separate entities from the darkness itself. They were large, roughly humanoid, but with proportions that didn't quite match human anatomy. Their limbs seemed too long, their movements too fluid, their heads tilted at angles that suggested different skeletal structure than anything human. There were at least 4 of them, possibly more. They didn't attack. They didn't make any aggressive moves. They simply positioned themselves between us and the direction we were trying to go. Back away slowly, I told Rachel. We retreated. The creatures didn't follow, but they turned to face us, their heads tracking our movement with an intelligence that was unmistakable and utterly terrifying. We ran. We abandoned our careful plan of following the marked boundary, abandoned our attempt to navigate with logic. We simply ran through the forest, crashing through undergrowth, scrambling over rocks, driven by a primal fear that overrode all rational thought. We didn't stop running until we were completely disoriented, until we had no idea which direction we'd come from or where we were in relation to anything. We collapsed in a ravine, both of us gasping, both of us shaking. What were those things? Rachel asked between breaths. I don't know, but I think they were guarding the boundary. I think they were making sure we couldn't leave. We huddled together in that ravine for the rest of the night, listening to the singing, listening to the sounds of movement in the forest. At some point, near dawn, we heard footsteps approaching our location. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, something very large moving through the forest. But it wasn't the creatures we'd seen before. It was something else. Something that walked on 2 legs, but with a gait that suggested different bone structure, different musculature. We could hear it breathing, heavy and rhythmic. We could hear it moving through the bushes that surrounded our ravine. It came close enough that I could make out a shape in the pre-dawn darkness. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in what looked like fur, but moving with articulation that suggested something more complex than simple animal hair. Its head was wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate, broader than it should be, with features that seemed to shift as I looked at them. It stood at the edge of our ravine, looking down at us, and it made a sound, not singing, but speech. The words were in English, but the pronunciation was slightly off, as if something was approximating our language rather than naturally speaking it. You came into our forest. You did not respect the boundaries. Now you will understand what the boundaries mean. The thing didn't move aggressively. It simply turned and walked away, its massive form disappearing back into the trees. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We climbed out of the ravine and started moving, direction no longer mattering, only movement mattering. We hiked for hours, or what felt like hours. Time seemed strange in that forest, stretched and contracted in ways that didn't match our internal sense of duration. Eventually, we found something that suggested we might be near the edge of the territory. The marked stones became more frequent. The carvings on the trees became more visible, as if we were approaching something important, something that marked a significant boundary. And then, we found the previous hikers. They were in a clearing surrounded by ancient hemlock trees, their remains partially decomposed, partially preserved by the cool mountain air. There were at least 10 of them, maybe more. They were arranged in a pattern, positioned as if they were sleeping, their remains distributed in a careful geometric arrangement. On the rocks around them were more carvings, more symbols, and there was text. Someone had carved words into a flat stone surface, words that had been added over time by multiple hands, multiple hikers who had come to this place and understood what was about to happen to them. It will not let us leave. The forest is alive. It knows who we are. It has decided we belong here now. Do not resist. Resistance only prolongs the process. Accept what is happening. I can feel it in my mind. It's learning me, learning who I am. I don't think I'm me anymore. My name was Sarah. I think I was Sarah. I'm not sure anymore. There were dozens of messages, carved into stone with what must have been desperate effort, left behind as evidence by people who had slowly lost themselves to whatever controlled this forest. Rachel grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the clearing. We have to go, now. We have to get out of here now, we ran. This time, we ran with purpose. We ran toward the direction where the marked stones were densest, assuming that direction would take us to the boundary, to the edge of the territory, to freedom. The forest tried to stop us. The paths became harder to navigate. The ground seemed to shift beneath our feet. The singing grew louder, more complex, almost like it was trying to communicate something specific. And we could hear the creatures pursuing us, hear their footsteps behind us, hear their sounds of pursuit. But we ran harder. We pushed past pain and fear and exhaustion, driven by a need to escape that transcended everything else. And then, suddenly, we were through. The forest simply ended. We burst through a final line of trees and found ourselves in a normal forest, one that looked like every other forest in the Blue Ridge, with normal topology and normal distance and normal geography. Behind us, we could still see the marked trees, the boundary of the territory, the edge of the place where things didn't follow the rules. We didn't stop running until we could no longer see the marked boundary. We ran down the mountainside, following drainage patterns, moving toward lower elevation. We ran until we were completely exhausted, until we physically couldn't run anymore. It took us 2 days of hiking to reach the base of the mountain and find a trail that led to a road. It took us another day of hitchhiking to reach Rachel's car. When we finally made it back to civilization, both of us were dehydrated, exhausted, and traumatized. We didn't contact the Park Service immediately. We didn't report the things we'd seen or the remains we'd found. We wanted to, but we also knew that we didn't have physical evidence. that our testimony would sound like hysteria or wilderness-induced paranoia. Instead, I spent a week researching the history of that section of the trail. I looked for reports of missing hikers, for documented disappearances, for anything that might corroborate what we'd experienced. What I found was deeply unsettling. The section of trail we'd been on had a notably higher disappearance rate than the AT average. Over the past 30 years, at least 47 hikers had gone missing or turned out to be unrecoverable in that specific area. The disappearances were spread out enough that they didn't cluster, obviously, didn't draw significant attention. They were treated as routine wilderness accidents, lost hikers, unfortunate tragedies. But the pattern was there. The disappearances were concentrated in one area, one territory, one place where something had decided that trespassers didn't get to leave. I tried to contact the Park Service with information about the clearing with the remains. I reported the coordinates, described the location, indicated that there were human remains that should be recovered and studied. The ranger I spoke with seemed dismissive, suggested that if there were remains, they would have been reported by other hikers, suggested that my GPS coordinates might be inaccurate. Nothing was ever recovered. No investigation was launched. The area remained open to hikers, and people continued to disappear at a steady rate, 1 or 2 per year, their losses attributed to accident or misadventure. Rachel and I don't hike the Appalachian Trail anymore. We tried, once, to hike a different section in Pennsylvania, but after a few hours on the trail, we both experienced a sense of profound wrongness. The forest didn't feel hostile, but it didn't feel safe either. We turned back. I believe that what we encountered in the Blue Ridge was a territorial entity, something that controlled a specific piece of the forest and had learned over a very long time how to hunt humans, how to trap them within its boundaries, how to slowly incorporate them into itself. I believe it was intelligent and deliberate and utterly indifferent to human notions of right and wrong. I believe that it is still there, still hunting, still adding to the collection of lost hikers in that clearing surrounded by ancient hemlocks. And I believe that if you hike that section of the Appalachian Trail, if you camp near Catawba Lake or McAfee Knob, if you ignore the warnings that previous hikers might have left, then you will discover what Rachel and I discovered, that some places don't want you there, that some forests have claimed the right to keep what wanders into them, and that the mountains of Appalachia contain secrets that people who go hiking have no business discovering. The singing has never stopped. Even from distance, on nights when the wind is right, I can hear it. That vocalization that sounds like the forest learning language, learning how to call to hikers, learning how to make them want to come deeper into the trees. I never finished that section of the trail. I never collected the experiences I was supposed to collect, and I've accepted that I never will. Some trails, once entered, refuse to let their hikers go, and something in those mountains is patient enough to wait for the next person who doesn't understand that not all wilderness welcomes visitors. It's waiting still.